Hey friends, around 70% of viewers who watch my videos haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. It would truly mean a lot to me. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps the videos reach more people and really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much. Let me know in the comments which city or country are you watching from. The road had been empty for miles, the kind of emptiness that presses on your chest when you are deep in the middle of nowhere. No houses, no cars, no signs of life except the trees lining both sides of the cracked asphalt. I had been driving for hours, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. My phone had lost signal a while ago, and the gas tank was hovering near empty. I knew I had to find a place to stop soon or risk being stranded. The engine hummed steadily beneath me as I slowed down, scanning the roadside for anything. A gas station, a small town, a house with lights. Nothing. Just more trees, the occasional bird darting out of sight, and a thin line of clouds glowing faintly pink with the setting sun. I glanced down at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was warning me. I thought about turning back, but the way I came felt longer, and I hoped to find something ahead. Up ahead, I spotted an old wooden sign, worn and faded, leaning at a sharp angle. It was hard to read, but I thought it said Riverside Campground. My heart lifted slightly. A campground meant people, maybe a ranger station, maybe a place to get water or at least a phone signal. I turned off the road onto a dirt path, the car tires crunching on loose gravel. The trees grew closer here, dense and dark, the canopy blotting out the last rays of sunlight quickly. I drove slowly, the car's headlights barely cutting through the thickening shadows. Branches scraped the roof, and the air smelled damp, like earth and pine needles. I followed the narrow trail for maybe a mile before the path opened into a small clearing. There was a rickety wooden building off to one side, probably an old office or a check-in booth. It looked abandoned, paint peeling, windows dusty and cracked. A few rusty picnic tables sat scattered nearby, some overturned. No cars, no people. The stillness felt heavy. I parked and stepped out, the ground soft beneath my boots. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of the river the sign had mentioned. I walked a few steps toward the edge of the clearing and spotted the water. A slow-moving, wide river lined with reeds and fallen logs. The surface reflected the deepening sky, now a navy blue with hints of stars starting to peek out. I checked my watch. Almost dark. I needed to decide quickly if I should stay here or keep going. The campground didn't look welcoming or safe, but it was better than being stuck on the road. I grabbed the small backpack from the passenger seat. Inside were a few snacks, a flashlight, a blanket, and a water bottle. I decided to set up a makeshift camp near the riverbank, hoping the spot was at least dry. I found a flat patch of ground sheltered by low bushes and started laying out the blanket. The flashlight beam danced around, illuminating the underbrush and the trunks of trees nearby. The sounds of the forest were alive now. Crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of small animals in the leaves, and the soft rush of the river. The peace was comforting but also a little eerie in its isolation. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I pulled my jacket tighter and ate a granola bar, the crumbs falling onto the blanket. The sky was clear, full of stars brighter than I had ever seen. Felt like I was the only person on Earth. The silence was deep except for the natural sounds around me. Hours passed. I stayed awake, partly because the idea of sleeping here alone in the dark unsettled me, but mostly because I didn't want to lose time. I planned to start walking along the river in the morning, hoping to find a road or someone who could help. Suddenly, a noise from deeper in the woods caught my attention. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, holding my breath. The noise stopped as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. But the woods here were thick, and no path seemed close enough for something larger. I switched on the flashlight again and swept the beam toward the trees. Shadows moved, but no clear shape appeared. The wind picked up slightly, rustling branches and carrying fresh scents of moss and wet earth. I tried to calm my mind, reminding myself that I was in a remote place and that strange noises were normal. I lay down on the blanket, using my jacket as a pillow, and stared at the sky. Sleep was slow to come, but eventually exhaustion took over. Morning arrived with cold light filtering through the trees. The river gleamed silver, and the air smelled fresher. I packed up my things quickly and decided to follow the riverbank, hoping it would lead to a road or signs of civilization. The ground was muddy in places, and I had to step carefully over fallen branches and rocks. My boots slipped now and then, but I kept moving. The river curved gently, sometimes disappearing behind thick bushes or rocky outcrops. I saw tracks, animal footprints mostly, but some looked like tire marks from a heavy vehicle, maybe a truck or ATV. After walking for nearly 2 hours, the forest began to thin, and in the distance, I spotted a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the trees. My heart lifted. I hurried toward it and finally emerged onto a quiet country road. There was a mailbox with a faded number on it and a wooden post with a small, rusty street sign. No houses were visible yet, but the road was a clear sign of human presence. I started walking along it, hoping to find a house or a gas station soon. After about a mile, I saw smoke rising in the distance and a faint smell of burning wood. I quickened my pace and came to a small cabin with a chimney gently puffing gray smoke. The porch was worn but looked cared for, with a stack of firewood neatly piled to one side. No one was outside, but the door was slightly ajar. I knocked and called out, but there was no answer. I stepped inside carefully. The cabin was simple: a small kitchen, a living room with an old sofa, and a wood stove that still had ashes in it. There was fresh water in a metal pot on the stove, and some canned food in a cupboard. It wasn't much, but it was safe and warm. I sat down and rested for a long time, feeling the relief wash over me. I was no longer alone in the middle of nowhere. Later that afternoon, as I rested, I heard a car approaching on the road outside. I went to the window and saw an older man in a pickup truck slowing down near the cabin. He waved when he saw me and called out that the nearest town was only a few miles down the road, and that I could catch a ride with him if I wanted. I accepted immediately, feeling a grateful weight lift off my shoulders. The middle of nowhere had felt endless and unforgiving, but step by step, I had found my way back to safety. It wasn't a story of miracles or strange forces, just the quiet reality of being lost, the slow work of survival, and the luck of finding signs of life when you need them most. That night, back in a small motel in town, I thought about the woods, the silence, and the river. The middle of nowhere wasn't a place of mystery or fear. It was just a place where the world was simple and raw, and sometimes you had to trust your own steps to find the way out. The sun was already dipping low when I finally reached the dirt road that cut through the middle of nowhere. The road was narrow, rutted with deep tire tracks and covered in loose gravel that crunched under my boots. Tall trees crowded on either side, their branches twisting toward the sky like desperate hands. I had been hiking for hours, far away from any town or highway, and my backpack felt heavier with every step. The air smelled sharp, a mixture of pine needles, damp earth, and the faint scent of something old and forgotten. I was alone, just the way I wanted it. No people, no noise except for the occasional bird or the wind rattling dry leaves. The silence was thick, not peaceful exactly, but full, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept walking, following the uneven trail that curved alongside a slow-moving creek. The water was clear but cold, flowing over rocks smoothed by time. A few fish darted beneath the surface, flickering silver shadows. About an hour later, the forest opened up to a small clearing. It looked like it hadn't seen a human in years. The grass was overgrown, tall and wild, bending in waves with the breeze. In the middle stood an old cabin, its wooden planks faded to gray and warped from weather. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were cracked and clouded. I approached cautiously, boots sinking slightly into soft earth mixed with fallen leaves and pine needles. The door hung ajar, creaking slightly as it swung in the wind. I wasn't here for a storybook adventure, or to find some lost treasure. I came because I wanted to be somewhere untouched, somewhere real, somewhere that made me feel small but not scared, at least not yet. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled of must and dust. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I stepped carefully. There was an old wood stove in one corner, rusty but still solid. Against one wall, a table lay toppled, broken into splinters. Scattered papers, yellowed and brittle, littered the floor near a small bookshelf that held a few warped books and faded photographs. The images showed a man and a woman, smiling in front of this very cabin, with a small child between them. The years etched into their faces told a story of hard work and quiet life. I moved to the window and looked outside. The sun was nearly gone, casting long shadows that stretched over the field. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, the last colors before night. It was easy to imagine this place full of life. Once, the family here must have lived in isolation, surrounded by nature but still tied to the world in their own way. How long had it been since anyone walked these grounds? 5 years? 10? I decided to stay the night. My pack held a small stove and some food, and I had a thick blanket. I cleared some debris from a corner, laying down the blanket on the cold wooden floor. As darkness settled, the forest outside grew quiet. No rustling animals, no distant cars or planes. Just stillness. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I tried to calm the rising tension in my chest. Later, as I sat near the broken table, I noticed a small metal box tucked under a loose floorboard. It was locked, but the latch was fragile. Using a knife from my pack, I pried it open. Inside were a few old letters, tied with a faded ribbon, and a small leather pouch. The letters were brittle and the ink faded, but I could still make out some words. They were written by the man in the photos to his wife. They spoke of daily struggles, of dreams for their child, and plans to fix the roof before winter. One letter mentioned a visit to the nearby town to buy supplies. Another told of a harsh storm that tore through the area. The pouch contained a handful of old coins, worn smooth by time, and a small key. I wondered what the key opened. The cabin held no obvious locks, but maybe there was a chest or another hidden box somewhere. For a moment, I considered searching, but the night was growing colder, and I needed to rest. Outside, the stars began to appear, scattered across the sky like tiny pinpricks of light. The moon rose pale and distant, illuminating the treetops with a soft glow. I lay back on the blanket, staring up through the broken roof beams where the sky peeked in. The sounds of the forest seemed gentler now. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted softly. Sleep came slowly. The old cabin creaked and groaned with the wind, and every so often, a branch scraped against the window frame. But I felt no fear. Instead, I felt connected to this place, to the past lives that had passed through here, and to the quiet pulse of the natural world. It was a reminder that life, in all its forms, continued even when no one was watching. When morning finally broke, pale light filtering through the trees, I packed my things. I locked the metal box and placed it back under the floorboard. The cabin, with all its history and silence, had shared a small part of its story with me. As I stepped outside, the air was crisp, and the creek babbled softly nearby. Walking back down the dirt road, I felt a strange peace. The world outside might be loud and chaotic, but here, in the middle of nowhere, time moved differently. It was slower, more honest. The cabin and its memories stayed behind, tucked away like a secret. I knew I would come back someday, maybe not soon, but when the noise of the world got too much. Because places like this, forgotten and quiet, remind you what really matters. Simple things, real things, the things that don't change no matter how far you go. The middle of nowhere wasn't just an empty space. It was a place full of stories, waiting to be found and understood. And that day I had found one. The sun had already set by the time I realized how far off the map I had wandered. I was somewhere deep in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any sign of civilization. The road I had been following had long since turned into a barely visible dirt track, swallowed by wild grass and twisted trees. The kind of place where the wind sounds like it's whispering secrets and every shadow feels like it's alive. I hadn't planned on getting lost, but that's exactly what happened. And there was no one around to help or even notice. I had left the small town early that day, wanting to get away from the noise and the crowded streets. I like to explore sometimes, just drive until the roads turned rough and the houses stopped. That day, I thought I'd find a quiet spot to sit by a river or just watch the sky change colors. But somewhere after a fork I didn't recognize, my GPS lost signal, and my phone's battery was already low. I kept going, thinking the dirt road would lead me back, but it only got narrower and more overgrown. The last traces of sunlight disappeared completely, and the night settled in like a thick blanket. I pulled the car over beside a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, hoping to rest for a while and figure out my next move. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I shut off the engine, and for a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of insects and the distant calls of night birds. No streetlights, no distant cars, no human sounds at all. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes scanning the dark forest around me. The trees stood like silent guards, their branches twisting overhead and blotting out the stars. My phone buzzed once, then died. No signal, no help, just me and the night. The reality of being completely alone started to sink in. I thought about walking back to the last road I knew, but the thick underbrush and the uneven ground made the idea less appealing. Besides, I didn't know if I could find it again. My car, old and reliable, was still fine for now, but I worried about how much fuel I had left. There was no gas station around for miles. The temperature dropped fast. I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself and tried to calm the sudden rush of anxiety. Being alone in a place like this feels different from just being in the country during the day. At night, the dark plays tricks on your mind. Every small noise seems louder. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, the distant howling of coyotes. I tried to remind myself I wasn't in any real danger, just stuck. After an hour or so, I decided to get out and stretch. The forest was dark, but the moon had risen and spilled a cold, pale light over the clearing. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the dry grass, and looked around. The trees were tall and straight, and the ground was covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. I could see the faint outline of a small stream running nearby. It gave me hope that at least there was water if I needed it. I walked over to the stream and knelt by the edge. The water was clear and cold, and I cupped my hands to take a drink. The sound of the water flowing was steady and soothing, and for a moment, I felt less alone. The night was quiet except for the stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. As I stood up, I noticed something unusual. Near the water's edge, half buried in the mud, was a small metal box. It looked old, rusty around the edges, but still intact. Curiosity pushed me forward. I reached down and pulled it out, wiping away the dirt. It was locked, but the latch was weak. I managed to pry it open with a stick. Inside, I found a few old papers, some photographs, and a small notebook. The papers were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten notes and maps. The photographs showed a man and a woman standing in front of what looked like a cabin, surrounded by the same forest. The notebook was filled with daily entries, dated back over 50 years. It was like a forgotten piece of someone's life left behind in the woods. I sat down by the stream, reading through the pages by the moonlight. The entries told a story of two people who had moved out here to live away from the world, building their own home and trying to make a simple life. They wrote about the hard work, the changing seasons, and the wild animals that came near their cabin. The last entry was hurried and stopped abruptly, mentioning a heavy storm coming and the man going out to secure things. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the clearing, trying to imagine where the cabin might have been. If it was still out here, maybe it was abandoned, lost in the forest as nature took it back. I wondered what had happened to those people and why no one came looking for them. Suddenly, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through the air. I packed the notebook and papers carefully into my backpack, deciding to bring them with me. Maybe they would help me find the cabin, or at least tell me more if I ever got back to town. I returned to the car and started the engine. My plan was to follow the stream downstream. Water usually leads to a road or a settlement. I kept my headlights low, scanning the trees on both sides. The road was rough, full of potholes and loose rocks, but I managed to keep moving slowly. After nearly an hour of driving, the forest began to thin, and I saw the faint glow of lights ahead. A small farmhouse appeared, smoke rising from its chimney, and a dirt driveway leading to the main road. Relief washed over me like a wave. I stopped and knocked on the door, and an older man answered. I explained my situation without much detail and showed him the notebook. His eyes widened in recognition. He told me the story of the couple, his grandparents, who had lived in that cabin long ago before disappearing during a terrible storm. He offered me a place to rest, food, and a phone to call for help. I accepted gratefully, knowing I was finally safe. The notebook and photos stayed with me, a tangible link to a forgotten past, discovered in the middle of nowhere. That night, lying on a worn-out couch in a warm house, I realized something important. Sometimes getting lost isn't just about being stuck or scared. It can lead to finding stories, history, and a deeper connection to a place you thought you knew. And even in the darkest, most forgotten corners of the world, there are people and lives waiting to be remembered. I slept with the window open a little, listening to the quiet night outside, feeling for the first time that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I had been driving for hours, following a narrow dirt road that stretched out into nothing but thick forest and empty fields. The sun was starting to set, but there was no sign of any town or even a single house. The GPS on my phone had lost signal a long time ago. I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and I knew it. The road was bumpy, covered in loose gravel, and flanked on both sides by tall trees that looked like they hadn't seen a human in years. The smell of damp earth and pine was thick in the air. I was on my way to a remote cabin I had rented for the weekend, a place I hoped would give me a break from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of work. The cabin was supposed to be a small wooden structure, built decades ago but still in decent shape, tucked away in the woods, far from any other buildings. It was exactly what I needed, a place where I could be alone, with no distractions, just the quiet of nature. The dirt road curved sharply, and I had to slow down as the trees closed in tighter around me. The branches scratched the sides of my car, and I could feel the wind picking up. A few birds flew overhead, their calls echoing through the trees. It was peaceful but also a little unsettling. The isolation made everything feel heavier, like the silence was pressing down on me. After about another mile, I saw it. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. It was rough and weathered, the wood darkened by years of rain and sun. A thin trail of smoke curled up from the chimney, which surprised me because I hadn't expected anyone else to be there. The windows were small and dusty, and the porch sagged in the middle, but the place looked solid. I pulled the car up to the gravel driveway and shut it off. The engine's hum faded into the quiet, leaving only the sounds of the forest around me. My boots crunched on the gravel as I stepped out and walked toward the cabin. The air was cooler here, and I could smell the faint scent of wood smoke mixed with pine needles and moss. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The inside was dim but not dark. Dust floated in the beams of fading sunlight that slipped through the windows. The floor creaked underfoot, and I could see old furniture covered in sheets. There was a small fireplace with a stack of firewood next to it, a wooden table with some worn chairs, and a narrow staircase leading upstairs. The cabin smelled of old wood, earth, and something faintly musty. I set my bags down and walked around, feeling the quiet settle over me like a blanket. I opened the windows to let in fresh air, and I found a stack of firewood by the back door. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees thick and still. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension from the city start to loosen. As the sun disappeared completely, the sky turned a deep, dark blue. The stars started to come out, one by one, and the moon rose high, casting pale light through the trees. I built a fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling and warming the room. The soft glow from the fire pushed back the shadows, but outside, the darkness was still thick and complete. I sat by the fire for a long time, watching the flames dance and listening to the quiet sounds outside. Leaves rustling, an occasional bird call, the distant snap of a twig. The stillness was heavy, but it was also calming in a way I hadn't felt in years. I felt small in this vast wilderness, but not lost, just alone, and for once that was exactly what I wanted. Later, I went outside to stretch my legs and look around the clearing. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. The trees were tall and close, and the forest floor was uneven with roots and rocks. I walked a few steps away from the cabin, just far enough to hear the silence without the crackle of the fire behind me. The night was cold, but not biting. I could see my breath in the air, and the moonlight made everything look silver and strange. That's when I noticed something. A small, faint light flickering between the trees, deeper in the woods. It wasn't from the cabin's chimney smoke. It was lower, smaller, like a flashlight or maybe a lantern. My heart rate picked up slightly, but I told myself it was probably someone else camping or hiking nearby. Still, I hadn't seen any cars or signs of people on the road, and it was already late. Who else could be here? I decided to keep an eye on it from the porch. The light stayed in the same spot, moving slowly, as if someone was walking in circles or pacing. I grabbed my phone to check the GPS again, but no signal. I thought about calling someone or driving back, but the road was dark and unfamiliar, and the idea of leaving the safety of the cabin didn't seem smart. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight and added more wood to the fire. I sat back down in front of the flames and kept watching the light through the trees. After a while, it disappeared. I waited for a long time, but it didn't come back. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made me tense. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the distant howl of a coyote. The isolation was heavier than I expected. But when the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, everything felt different. The forest looked less threatening, and the sun's warm glow made the cabin feel like a shelter again. I packed my things and got ready to leave. Before I got in the car, I took one last look at the clearing and the dense woods beyond. The flickering light from the night before made sense now. I noticed faint tire tracks in the soft dirt, barely visible in the morning light, leading off the road into the trees. Someone had come here, probably the person with the light. Maybe they were lost or looking for something. I started the car and carefully drove back the way I came, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The sun rose higher, lighting up the road and the trees. The forest looked calm and normal, like nothing had happened. By the time I reached the main highway, the feeling of being stranded was gone. The noise of other cars and the smell of pavement brought me back to the real world. The experience in the middle of nowhere stayed with me, though, a reminder of how quiet and vast the world can be when you step away from everything familiar, and how even in the most empty places you're never completely alone. I was driving through a part of the country I barely knew, a stretch of road where the world seemed to disappear, swallowed by thick trees and rolling hills. It was the kind of place people only passed through if they had a reason, or if they got lost. I didn't have a reason. I was just looking for a quiet place to clear my head, away from the noise of the city and the endless rush of everyday life. The sun was setting when I took a narrow dirt road off the main highway. It was barely wide enough for my old truck, and the trees leaned over it, their branches brushing the roof like ghostly fingers. The air smelled like pine and earth, sharp and clean, different from the smog I was used to. I turned off the headlights to see better in the fading light, hoping to catch a glimpse of the sky through the canopy above. The stars were starting to blink awake. I had been driving for over an hour on this lonely trail when the truck suddenly shuddered and slowed down. I pulled over onto the soft shoulder, heart sinking as I realized the engine had died. The truck wouldn't start again. I tried the ignition a few times, but all I got was a stubborn silence. My phone had no signal, no way to call for help. Just me, the truck, and the vast quiet of nowhere. The temperature dropped quickly. It was fall, but out here, with no city lights or warmth, The cold cut through my jacket like a knife. I grabbed my flashlight and my backpack from the truck bed. Inside, I had a few things I thought I might need. A small first aid kit, some granola bars, a water bottle, a lighter, and a thick wool blanket. I knew I couldn't stay in the truck forever. If no one came, I'd have to try to find help on foot. I locked the truck and started walking down the road, my footsteps soft on the dirt. The trees were so dense that it felt like the sun had disappeared entirely. The forest was alive with small sounds, leaves rustling, the distant snap of twigs, the low hum of insects. But there was no wind, no sign of any large animal. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to focus on what I could control. After about half an hour, the road curved sharply, and I saw something faint in the distance, what looked like a building, a small cabin maybe. Relief washed over me. I picked up my pace, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot growing louder. As I got closer, I saw it was an old wooden cabin, weathered by time but still standing firm. The porch sagged a little and the windows were dirty, but the door was closed tight. I checked my flashlight battery and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, echoing in the empty space. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and dust. There was an old fireplace with some ashes in it, a rickety table with a broken chair, and a rusty stove in the corner. It was cold inside, but at least it was shelter. I set my backpack down and pulled out the blanket. I found some dry wood piled near the fireplace and managed to start a small fire with my lighter. The warmth was immediate, and the flickering flames made the shadows dance on the walls. I sat down close, rubbing my hands together and feeling some of the fear ease away. Night deepened outside, and the silence was almost complete. No distant cars, no flashing lights, just the occasional rustle of animals moving through the trees. I checked my supplies again, just enough water and a couple of granola bars. I knew I needed to rest, but I also knew I couldn't stay here forever. Morning came slowly. Light filtered through the grimy windows, and the chill inside the cabin was sharper now that the fire had died. I wrapped the blanket tightly around myself and stepped outside, hoping to get a better view of my surroundings. The cabin was set in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. There was no sign of a nearby road or path, only the one I had walked along last night. I decided I had to go back to the truck. It was my best chance of being found or at least getting my phone to work somewhere close. I packed up my things, doused the remnants of the fire, and stepped back onto the dirt road. The truck was exactly where I left it, quiet and still. I tried the ignition again, and to my surprise, the engine sputtered and roared to life. Relief hit me like a wave. Whatever had gone wrong before must have been temporary. Maybe the fuel line had clogged or the battery was weak. I kept the truck running and sat inside for a few minutes, letting my hands stop shaking. I decided I couldn't just drive blindly back to the highway. I needed to mark my path somehow, so I pulled out a small pocket knife from my backpack and cut little marks on the trees as I retraced the dirt road back toward the highway. It took another hour or so of slow driving before I finally saw the familiar lights of the highway. My phone flickered with a signal, and I called for help to check the truck once I got home. The whole experience left me shaken but strangely clear-headed. I realized how easily things could go wrong in places like this, where nature was indifferent and there was no one around to help. The world felt bigger, harsher, and more real. I learned that being alone in the middle of nowhere isn't just about fear. It's about respect for the land and the limits of what you can control. I was lucky, but I also understood that luck doesn't always stay on your side. From that day on, I made sure to carry better supplies, tell someone where I was going, and never take quiet roads for granted. The middle of nowhere isn't just a place. It's a reminder of how small we are and how careful we need to be when we step away from everything familiar. And sometimes, the silence and the cold teach you more than any city noise ever could. I had been driving for hours, farther than I usually like to go, until the roads turned from asphalt to gravel and then to dirt. The sun was beginning to drop low in the sky, casting a dull orange light over the wide, empty fields and dense woods that stretched out on both sides of the road. This place was the middle of nowhere, the kind of spot where the nearest town was a good hour away, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees or the occasional bird calling from a hidden branch. My destination was a small, forgotten cabin that my grandfather had once mentioned in passing. He said it was somewhere deep in the woods, left untouched for years. I wasn't even sure if the cabin was still standing, but I wanted to see it for myself, to feel that silence, that loneliness that comes from being truly cut off. My phone had lost signal an hour ago, so I was on my own. The dirt road twisted through thick patches of pine and oak. It wasn't wide, barely enough for one car to pass, and I had to slow down whenever the dust got too thick or the ruts grew deep. At some point, I had to get out and push the car through a muddy patch that threatened to trap the tires. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, sharp and clean, but the further I went, the heavier the silence became. After what felt like forever, I spotted the cabin. It was small and made of rough, weathered logs with a rusty tin roof that looked like it had been patched up several times. The windows were grimy but intact, though I couldn't tell if there was anything inside. A narrow path, overgrown with weeds and brambles, led up to the front door. I stepped out of the car and felt the weight of the place press down on me. No birds sang here, no animals stirred. The only sound was the faint creak of the cabin settling in the cool evening breeze. I walked to the door and found it locked tight, the old padlock hanging loose from the latch but still stubbornly in place. The wood beneath my fingers was rough and dry, cracked from years of exposure. I circled the cabin, looking for another way in. Around the back there was a small window, but it was nailed shut from the inside. The whole structure seemed untouched, like it was waiting for someone who might never come back. I thought about breaking a window to get inside, but something stopped me. Maybe it was respect, or maybe just a gut feeling that this place was not meant to be disturbed. The sky darkened quickly. Stars began to twinkle faintly above the thick tree line, and the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and looked out over the forest. There was no road here, just endless trees that stretched for miles and miles, dark and silent. I decided I wouldn't stay long. The car was parked on the edge of the clearing, and I needed to be on my way before the night got too deep. But before I turned back, I noticed something else. Tracks in the dirt. Fresh tire marks, not from a big vehicle but a small truck or ATV. They led from the woods right up to the cabin, then disappeared again. Curious, I followed the tracks into the trees. They were easy to see in the soft dirt, zigzagging between the trees and disappearing deeper into the forest. I walked carefully, stepping over roots and low branches. The quiet was complete. No birds, no rustling animals. Just the sound of my boots pressing into the soft ground. After a while, I found the remnants of a campfire, cold now, with blackened stones and a few ashes scattered around. Nearby were some empty cans and a torn piece of fabric, faded and dirty. It was clear someone had been here recently. Not long ago. I felt a strange mix of unease and curiosity. Who could be out here in the middle of nowhere with no signs of roads or neighbors nearby? And why had they left so suddenly? I decided to head back to the car. The forest seemed darker now, shadows stretching longer. The air was cooler and the silence heavier. I kept thinking about those tracks, about the people who might still be out here. The thought made me pick up my pace. When I reached the clearing, I paused and looked back toward the cabin. The moon had risen, casting a pale light on the old logs. The silence was absolute. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping behind the trees, but when I blinked, there was nothing there. I climbed back into the car, started the engine, and waited a moment to listen. No sounds came from the woods except the wind through the branches. The drive back was slow and careful. The gravel and dirt were harder to see in the dark, and the car's headlights only reached so far. I kept the windows up and the doors locked, eyes darting to the edges of the road, half expecting to see something move. When I finally hit the paved road, relief washed over me. The lights of the nearest town were visible in the distance, small and welcoming. I stopped at the first gas station and filled the tank, buying a bottle of water and some snacks. The clerk looked at me like I was crazy for being out that late in such a place, but I said nothing. That night, in the safety of my own home, I kept thinking about the cabin and the tracks, about the quiet loneliness of that place. I realized something important. Sometimes, being in the middle of nowhere means more than just being far from people. It means being in a place where time seems to stop, where nature and silence fill every corner, and where the unknown can feel as close as your own shadow. No ghosts, no monsters, just the raw reality of being alone with the earth and the dark. And that is enough to make a person feel small and careful, aware that sometimes the most real fears come from the silence itself. From the thought that maybe someone else out there isn't coming back, or that the world beyond the trees is just out of reach. In the end, the cabin was just a cabin and the tracks just tracks. But they reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in a long time. The power of being truly alone, in a place where no one is watching, and the quiet weight of that loneliness stays with you long after you leave. I found myself in the middle of nowhere, a place so far off the beaten path that no one I knew could say they had ever been there. It was one of those stretches of land where the trees seemed to grow tighter and darker, where the sky felt wider and emptier. The road had been nothing more than a cracked, narrow strip of asphalt flanked by overgrown weeds and wild bushes. I had been driving for hours, following a faded map I'd found in an old drawer, not really sure why I was drawn there. There was no cell phone signal, no other cars, no signs of civilization, just the endless green and brown of the forest and the occasional flicker of wildlife disappearing into the shadows. The sun was sinking low when I finally pulled over by a small clearing. It was a perfect spot to stop for the night. Flat ground, a little fire ring made of stones someone else had left behind, and enough room to pitch my tent. I unloaded my gear from the back of the car, careful not to make too much noise. The air smelled fresh but cold, filled with the damp earth and pine needles crushed underfoot. The trees surrounding the clearing were tall, old, and thick with moss. Every few minutes, I could hear the distant rustle of branches or the snap of twigs, reminders that I wasn't alone. I set up the tent, fumbling with the poles in the failing light. It was always a small battle with the wind and the uneven ground, but I got it up in the end. I laid out my sleeping bag inside and unpacked a small stove. Cooking was simple, just a can of beans heated over the flame and some bread I had brought along. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, feeling the cold seep through my jacket as the sky darkened. Night in the middle of nowhere was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of a city or a house with the TV off. It was the deep, raw silence filled with tiny sounds. A far-off bird, the wind through the trees, an animal moving somewhere just out of sight. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and crackle, feeling the warmth on my face. Above me, stars began to appear, scattered like tiny white sparks against the dark velvet sky. There was no moon that night, just the stars and the faint glow of the fire. The air was cold and smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke. It was peaceful, but there was also something tense about being so far from any help, so isolated. As the fire died down to glowing embers, I crawled into my tent. The ground beneath was hard and uneven, but the sleeping bag kept me warm enough. Outside, the forest seemed alive in a way that was hard to explain. There was movement in the shadows, the sound of animals moving through the brush, and the occasional sharp cry of a bird or a distant howl. I tried to focus on my breathing, telling myself everything was fine, but my mind kept drifting to the unknown sounds. Around midnight, something woke me. At first, it was just a faint noise, like something brushing against the outside of the tent. My heart jumped. I stayed still, holding my breath, trying to listen. The noise came again, a soft rustling close by, maybe a foot or two from the tent. It wasn't the wind or the sound of a small animal. It felt heavier, deliberate. I was frozen, eyes wide open in the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence of something moving slowly around my tent. My mind raced through the possibilities. A wild animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it was too quiet, too careful, almost like it was watching me. The noise moved closer to the side of the tent where my backpack was, and I could hear a faint scrape against the fabric. I wanted to scream or get up, but I didn't want to attract whatever it was. I stayed as still as I could, heart pounding, waiting for it to move away. After what felt like an eternity, the rustling stopped. The forest went silent again, except for the distant night sounds. I held my breath for a few more minutes, then slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside. There was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been so close to me. The fire pit was cold and empty. I looked around carefully, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I couldn't stay in the tent. The feeling of being watched was too strong. I grabbed my flashlight and my small knife and decided to walk a little. The path back to the car was only a few hundred yards, but the trees made it hard to see far. Every step was careful and slow, my eyes darting to every shadow. I felt exposed, but I had to keep moving. When I finally reached the car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, the engine off, listening. The forest seemed to settle, the sounds returning to normal. The radio in the car was dead, no signal, and my phone showed no bars. I sat there until the sky started to lighten with the first signs of dawn. The morning brought a sense of relief. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more ordinary. I packed up quickly, keeping an eye out for any signs of what had been near me the night before. There was nothing. No prints, no disturbance. Just the soft dirt and leaves. I started the car and drove back down the narrow road, the sun rising behind me. The feeling of isolation faded with every mile. The world slowly came back. The distant hum of trucks, the signs of farms and houses, the small towns where people went about their daily lives. That night, and the days after, I kept thinking about what had happened. There was no ghost, no monster, no storybook creature. Just me, a stranger in the middle of nowhere, faced with the raw, quiet power of the wilderness. It was a reminder that the forest is its own world, indifferent and sometimes dangerous, filled with creatures and shadows that don't need to be explained with fantasy. I never went back to that clearing. I don't know if it was an animal or something else that came close that night, but I learned to respect how thin the line can be between calm and fear when you are truly alone in the wild. The experience stayed with me. A quiet warning that sometimes the scariest things are the things you can't see or understand, and that's enough. The sky was a deep shade of orange, stretching across the wide open fields that seemed to go on forever. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town or even a small cluster of houses. My old truck was parked beside a dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen a car in weeks, maybe months. The tires had sunk slightly into the loose dirt, and the smell of dry earth filled the air, mixed with the faint scent of pine from the sparse trees that dotted the horizon. There was nothing around except for tall grass swaying slowly in the breeze and the distant hum of insects settling in for the night. I had taken this route without much thought earlier that day, driving out here to clear my head. The week had been long, stressful, full of problems that felt too big to fix. So when I saw the turnoff to this dirt road, I took it. No map, no phone signal, just the truck and me. The silence was something I hadn't felt in years. No honking cars, no chatter, just the quiet whisper of the wind. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the sky was quickly turning a deep purple. I climbed out of the truck and stretched my legs, looking around. The landscape was flat, but for the occasional rise in the distance, a gentle hill or two. The grass was dry, yellowed by the late summer heat, with patches of green closer to the trees. A few birds flew overhead, heading to their nests. The only sounds were the soft rustling of the grass and the faint cracking of twigs beneath my boots. I decided to walk a little down the road, just to get a better feel for the place. The dirt was hard but loose, crunching underfoot. I noticed how the air smelled cleaner here, fresher than the city's dusty streets. There was a calmness that crept into my chest, like the land itself was slowing my thoughts down. After about half an hour of walking, I spotted something ahead. A small wooden structure half hidden by a clump of trees. It looked like an old shed or hunting cabin, weathered by years of sun and rain. The wood was faded and cracked, with moss growing along the edges of the roof. Curious, I approached it carefully, the grass now taller and brushing against my pants. There was no path leading to it, just the rough terrain that surrounded everything else. The door hung slightly off its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. I pushed it open with a gentle shove and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the smell of old wood. Inside, the floorboards were uneven, some warped with age. There was a small table in one corner, covered in dirt and a few rusty nails scattered around. A single window let in the last rays of sunlight, casting long shadows across the floor. I ran my fingers over the rough wood of the table, imagining who might have used this place. Maybe a hunter or a farmer taking shelter during a storm. The place felt forgotten, like a snapshot of someone's past left behind. Suddenly, a noise caught my attention, a soft thumping sound coming from outside. I froze, heart beating a little faster. It wasn't the wind. I moved slowly toward the window and peered out. A deer was stepping carefully through the grass, ears twitching, eyes wide. It seemed nervous, probably because of my presence, but it wasn't scared enough to run yet. The quiet thumps were its hooves against the dirt. I stayed still, watching it graze near the trees, its breath visible in the cooling air. The moment felt peaceful, real. For a second, all the noise from my life melted away, replaced by the simple rhythm of nature. After a while, the deer moved on, disappearing behind the trees. The light outside dimmed quickly, and the night was settling in. I knew I needed to head back before it got too dark, but I took one last look around the cabin. There was an old, rusty lantern hanging on the wall, broken and empty. I took it with me anyway, thinking it might come in handy. The walk back to the truck was slower, the darkness wrapping around the land like a heavy blanket. The sky was now a deep blue, scattered with stars that shone bright and cold. The moon hung low, casting pale light on the fields and trees. When I reached the truck, I pulled out the lantern and tried to get it working. The glass was cracked, and the wick was dry and brittle. I knew it wouldn't light. I shrugged and put it down on the hood anyway. The soft glow of my phone's flashlight was the only light I had now, but there was no signal, no messages, no calls. I sat on the tailgate, looking out at the endless darkness beyond the headlights. The silence was thick but not empty. I could hear the distant call of an owl, the buzz of insects, and the steady rustling of the wind in the grass. It felt like the whole world had shrunk down to this moment, this place. After a while, I started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, the headlights cutting through the black like two sharp knives. Slowly, I drove back toward the main road, the dirt kicking up behind me. The night was quiet the whole way. No other cars passed by. No signs of people. Just me, the truck, and the vast empty land stretching in all directions. When I finally reached the paved road, the city lights were a distant glow on the horizon. I pulled onto the highway and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I was back where things made sense, where there were people and noise and signs of life. Sadness that the quiet and the calm of that place would soon be swallowed up by the rush and chaos of everyday life again. Driving home, I kept thinking about the shed and the deer and how real and untouched everything had felt. It wasn't a place of mystery or fear. It was just a place where time slowed, where the world seemed bigger and smaller all at once. That night, lying in my bed, I realized I didn't need to escape forever. Sometimes all it takes is a few hours in the middle of nowhere to find a kind of peace that lasts a little longer than the moment itself. The kind of peace you carry inside you when the noise comes back. And that was enough. The sun was already low in the sky when I reached the small dirt road that led deep into the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where the map stopped showing proper names, just a tangle of faint lines disappearing into thick green. I had been driving for hours on the highway, watching the landscape turn from wide fields to dense forest, with nothing but the sound of my tires crunching on gravel to keep me company. There was no cell signal here, no sign of life except for the occasional bird or squirrel darting through the underbrush. My plan was simple, to find a quiet spot and camp alone for a night. I needed a break from everything, work, noise, the endless stream of people. Just me and the woods to clear my head. I wasn't after some grand adventure, just a few hours away from everything. The kind of place where you could feel the weight of silence settle over you, where the sky stretched wide and dark, and the only light came from the stars. The dirt road twisted and turned, narrow enough that I had to slow the truck down to avoid hitting trees on either side. The branches reached out, scraping the paint, and the smell of pine filled the air. I kept driving until I saw a small clearing on the right, just big enough to pull over. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. Felt like a good spot. I unloaded my gear quietly: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, and some food. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I pitched the tent carefully, making sure the floor was flat and clear of sticks and stones. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects and birds settling down for the night. A cool breeze rustled through the leaves, and the smell of damp earth mixed with pine was sharp and clean. As darkness fell, I lit a small fire in the pit I had cleared earlier. The flames crackled and threw warm light around the clearing. I sat close, stirring a simple meal on the stove, just some canned beans and rice. Eating slowly, I looked up at the sky where the first stars were starting to appear. No city lights, no noise, just the soft sounds of the forest. The quiet was almost overwhelming. I realized how little I had noticed the absence of sound in my daily life. Here, in the middle of nowhere, everything felt different. The world was bigger, and I was just a small part of it. I let my mind wander, thinking about how easy it was to get lost in the rush of everyday things and forget about this. Being alone, surrounded by nature, completely unplugged. After eating, I cleaned up and settled into the tent. The walls of fabric kept out the chill, but I could still hear the forest breathing all around me. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted softly. The night was dark but not oppressive. I felt calm, even a little tired. Then, around midnight, I heard a noise that made me sit up. It was faint at first, a rustling, something moving through the trees. I stayed still, listening. The sound came closer, deliberate steps crunching on leaves and twigs. My heart started to beat faster, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving through the underbrush. The noise stopped just outside the clearing, close enough that I could almost make out shapes in the moonlight filtering through the trees. I stayed quiet, watching. Nothing moved. Then, after a long pause, the sound shifted. A slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stepped out of the tent, shining the beam toward the edge of the clearing. The light caught on a shape partially hidden behind a tree. A large piece of old, rusted metal, like part of a broken-down machine or a discarded piece of farm equipment. It wasn't an animal, but the noise was real. I relaxed slightly but stayed alert. The forest felt different now, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because it reminded me how much history this place had, how people had passed through, left things behind, and how nature slowly reclaimed everything. The silence I had sought wasn't empty. It was full of stories, if you listened closely. I went back inside the tent and tried to sleep, but my mind kept going back to the noise. What if it wasn't just some old junk? What if someone else was out here? The thought made me uneasy. I had told a friend where I was going, but that was it. No one else would come here unless they knew exactly where to find me. Morning came with soft light filtering through the trees. I stepped outside and saw the clearing again, peaceful in the early sun. The air was cool and smelled fresh. I packed up my things carefully, keeping my eyes open for any sign of tracks or evidence of others. There were some footprints, too large and heavy to be animal but not fresh. Maybe an old hunter or someone passing through weeks ago. I started walking back toward the road, keeping my phone in my hand, hoping for a signal. After what felt like forever, the screen finally flickered to life. Messages, missed calls, and notifications flooded in. The world was back. Driving out, I realized that being in the middle of nowhere had changed something inside me. It wasn't about fear or adventure, but about perspective. The quiet had shown me how small my worries were, how much noise and distraction fill our lives, and how important it is to step back sometimes. The road opened up again to open fields and signs of life. Houses, cars, people going about their day. I looked back at the trees disappearing behind me and felt a calm I hadn't expected. I knew I'd return to the noise and chaos soon enough, but for a little while, the middle of nowhere had been exactly what I needed. Clear, real, and completely alive. The sun was already low in the sky when I reached the small dirt road that led deep into the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where the map stopped showing proper names, just a tangle of faint lines disappearing into thick green. I had been driving for hours on the highway, watching the landscape turn from wide fields to dense forest, with nothing but the sound of my tires crunching on gravel to keep me company. There was no cell signal here, no sign of life except for the occasional bird or squirrel darting through the underbrush. My plan was simple, to find a quiet spot and camp alone for a night. I needed a break from everything, work, noise, the endless stream of people. Just me and the woods to clear my head. I wasn't after some grand adventure, just a few hours away from everything. The kind of place where you could feel the weight of silence settle over you, where the sky stretched wide and dark, and the only light came from the stars. The dirt road twisted and turned, narrow enough that I had to slow the truck down to avoid hitting trees on either side. The branches reached out, scraping the paint, and the smell of pine filled the air. I kept driving until I saw a small clearing on the right, just big enough to pull over. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. Felt like a good spot. I unloaded my gear quietly: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, and some food. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I pitched the tent carefully, making sure the floor was flat and clear of sticks and stones. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects and birds settling down for the night. A cool breeze rustled through the leaves, and the smell of damp earth mixed with pine was sharp and clean. As darkness fell, I lit a small fire in the pit I had cleared earlier. The flames crackled and threw warm light around the clearing. I sat close, stirring a simple meal on the stove, just some canned beans and rice. Eating slowly, I looked up at the sky where the first stars were starting to appear. No city lights, no noise, just the soft sounds of the forest. The quiet was almost overwhelming. I realized how little I had noticed the absence of sound in my daily life. Here, in the middle of nowhere, everything felt different. The world was bigger, and I was just a small part of it. I let my mind wander, thinking about how easy it was to get lost in the rush of everyday things and forget about this. Being alone, surrounded by nature, completely unplugged. After eating, I cleaned up and settled into the tent. The walls of fabric kept out the chill, but I could still hear the forest breathing all around me. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted softly. The night was dark but not oppressive. I felt calm, even a little tired. Then, around midnight, I heard a noise that made me sit up. It was faint at first, a rustling, something moving through the trees. I stayed still, listening. The sound came closer, deliberate steps crunching on leaves and twigs. My heart started to beat faster, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving through the underbrush. The noise stopped just outside the clearing, close enough that I could almost make out shapes in the moonlight filtering through the trees. I stayed quiet, watching. Nothing moved. Then, after a long pause, the sound shifted. A slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stepped out of the tent, shining the beam toward the edge of the clearing. The light caught on a shape partially hidden behind a tree. A large piece of old, rusted metal, like part of a broken-down machine or a discarded piece of farm equipment. It wasn't an animal, but the noise was real. I relaxed slightly but stayed alert. The forest felt different now. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because it reminded me how much history this place had, how people had passed through, left things behind, and how nature slowly reclaimed everything. The silence I had sought wasn't empty. It was full of stories, if you listened closely. I went back inside the tent and tried to sleep, but my mind kept going back to the noise. What if it wasn't just some old junk? What if someone else was out here? The thought made me uneasy. I had told a friend where I was going, but that was it. No one else would come here unless they knew exactly where to find me. Morning came with soft light filtering through the trees. I stepped outside and saw the clearing again, peaceful in the early sun. The air was cool and smelled fresh. I packed up my things carefully, keeping my eyes open for any sign of tracks or evidence of others. There were some footprints, too large and heavy to be animal but not fresh. Maybe an old hunter or someone passing through weeks ago. I started walking back toward the road, keeping my phone in my hand, hoping for a signal. After what felt like forever, the screen finally flickered to life. Messages, missed calls, and notifications flooded in. The world was back. Driving out, I realized that being in the middle of nowhere had changed something inside me. It wasn't about fear or adventure, but about perspective. The quiet had shown me how small my worries were, how much noise and distraction fill our lives, and how important it is to step back sometimes. The road opened up again to open fields and signs of life. Houses, cars, people going about their day. I looked back at the trees disappearing behind me and felt a calm I hadn't expected. I knew I'd return to the noise and chaos soon enough, but for a little while, the middle of nowhere had been exactly what I needed. Clear, real, and completely alive. I was driving through a part of the country I barely knew, a stretch of road where the world seemed to disappear, swallowed by thick trees and rolling hills. It was the kind of place people only passed through if they had a reason, or if they got lost. I didn't have a reason. I was just looking for a quiet place to clear my head, away from the noise of the city and the endless rush of everyday life. The sun was setting when I took a narrow dirt road off the main highway. It was barely wide enough for my old truck, and the trees leaned over it, their branches brushing the roof like ghostly fingers. The air smelled like pine and earth, sharp and clean, different from the smog I was used to. I turned off the headlights to see better in the fading light, hoping to catch a glimpse of the sky through the canopy above. The stars were starting to blink awake. I had been driving for over an hour on this lonely trail when the truck suddenly shuddered and slowed down. I pulled over onto the soft shoulder, heart sinking as I realized the engine had died. The truck wouldn't start again. I tried the ignition a few times, but all I got was a stubborn silence. My phone had no signal, no way to call for help. Just me, the truck, and the vast quiet of nowhere. The temperature dropped quickly. It was fall, but out here, with no city lights or warmth, the cold cut through my jacket like a knife. I grabbed my flashlight and my backpack from the truck bed. Inside, I had a few things I thought I might need. A small first aid kit, some granola bars, a water bottle, a lighter, and a thick wool blanket. I knew I couldn't stay in the truck forever. If no one came, I'd have to try to find help on foot. I locked the truck and started walking down the road, my footsteps soft on the dirt. The trees were so dense that it felt like the sun had disappeared entirely. The forest was alive with small sounds, leaves rustling, the distant snap of twigs, the low hum of insects. But there was no wind, no sign of any large animal. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to focus on what I could control. After about half an hour, the road curved sharply, and I saw something faint in the distance, what looked like a building, a small cabin maybe. Relief washed over me. I picked up my pace, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot growing louder. As I got closer, I saw it was an old wooden cabin, weathered by time but still standing firm. The porch sagged a little and the windows were dirty, but the door was closed tight. I checked my flashlight battery and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, echoing in the empty space. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and dust. There was an old fireplace with some ashes in it, a rickety table with a broken chair, and a rusty stove in the corner. It was cold inside, but at least it was shelter. I set my backpack down and pulled out the blanket. I found some dry wood piled near the fireplace and managed to start a small fire with my lighter. The warmth was immediate, and the flickering flames made the shadows dance on the walls. I sat down close, rubbing my hands together and feeling some of the fear ease away. Night deepened outside, and the silence was almost complete. No distant cars, no flashing lights, just the occasional rustle of animals moving through the trees. I checked my supplies again, just enough water and a couple of granola bars. I knew I needed to rest, but I also knew I couldn't stay here forever. Morning came slowly. Light filtered through the grimy windows, and the chill inside the cabin was sharper now that the fire had died. I wrapped the blanket tightly around myself and stepped outside, hoping to get a better view of my surroundings. The cabin was set in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. There was no sign of a nearby road or path, only the one I had walked along last night. I decided I had to go back to the truck. It was my best chance of being found or at least getting my phone to work somewhere close. I packed up my things, doused the remnants of the fire, and stepped back onto the dirt road. The truck was exactly where I left it, quiet and still. I tried the ignition again, and to my surprise, the engine sputtered and roared to life. Relief hit me like a wave. Whatever had gone wrong before must have been temporary. Maybe the fuel line had clogged or the battery was weak. I kept the truck running and sat inside for a few minutes, letting my hands stop shaking. I decided I couldn't just drive blindly back to the highway. I needed to mark my path somehow, so I pulled out a small pocket knife from my backpack and cut little marks on the trees as I retraced the dirt road back toward the highway. It took another hour or so of slow driving before I finally saw the familiar lights of the highway. My phone flickered with a signal, and I called for help to check the truck once I got home. The whole experience left me shaken but strangely clear-headed. I realized how easily things could go wrong in places like this, where nature was indifferent and there was no one around to help. The world felt bigger, harsher, and more real. I learned that being alone in the middle of nowhere isn't just about fear. It's about respect for the land and the limits of what you can control. I was lucky, but I also understood that luck doesn't always stay on your side. From that day on, I made sure to carry better supplies, tell someone where I was going, and never take quiet roads for granted. The middle of nowhere isn't just a place. It's a reminder of how small we are and how careful we need to be when we step away from everything familiar. And sometimes, the silence and the cold teach you more than any city noise ever could. I found myself in the middle of nowhere, a place so far off the beaten path that no one I knew could say they had ever been there. It was one of those stretches of land where the trees seemed to grow tighter and darker, where the sky felt wider and emptier. The road had been nothing more than a cracked, narrow strip of asphalt flanked by overgrown weeds and wild bushes. I had been driving for hours, following a faded map I'd found in an old drawer, not really sure why I was drawn there. There was no cell phone signal, no other cars, no signs of civilization, just the endless green and brown of the forest and the occasional flicker of wildlife disappearing into the shadows. The sun was sinking low when I finally pulled over by a small clearing. It was a perfect spot to stop for the night. Flat ground, a little fire ring made of stones someone else had left behind, and enough room to pitch my tent. I unloaded my gear from the back of the car, careful not to make too much noise. The air smelled fresh but cold, filled with the damp earth and pine needles crushed underfoot. The trees surrounding the clearing were tall, old, and thick with moss. Every few minutes, I could hear the distant rustle of branches or the snap of twigs, reminders that I wasn't alone. I set up the tent, fumbling with the poles in the failing light. It was always a small battle with the wind and the uneven ground, but I got it up in the end. I laid out my sleeping bag inside and unpacked a small stove. Cooking was simple, just a can of beans heated over the flame and some bread I had brought along. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, feeling the cold seep through my jacket as the sky darkened. Night in the middle of nowhere was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of a city or a house with the TV off. It was the deep, raw silence filled with tiny sounds. A far-off bird, the wind through the trees, an animal moving somewhere just out of sight. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and crackle, feeling the warmth on my face. Above me, stars began to appear, scattered like tiny white sparks against the dark velvet sky. There was no moon that night, just the stars and the faint glow of the fire. The air was cold and smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke. It was peaceful, but there was also something tense about being so far from any help, so isolated. As the fire died down to glowing embers, I crawled into my tent. The ground beneath was hard and uneven, but the sleeping bag kept me warm enough. Outside, the forest seemed alive in a way that was hard to explain. There was movement in the shadows, the sound of animals moving through the brush, and the occasional sharp cry of a bird or a distant howl. I tried to focus on my breathing, telling myself everything was fine, but my mind kept drifting to the unknown sounds. Around midnight, something woke me. At first, it was just a faint noise, like something brushing against the outside of the tent. My heart jumped. I stayed still, holding my breath, trying to listen. The noise came again, a soft rustling close by, maybe a foot or two from the tent. It wasn't the wind or the sound of a small animal. It felt heavier, deliberate. I was frozen, eyes wide open in the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence of something moving slowly around my tent. My mind raced through the possibilities. A wild animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it was too quiet, too careful, almost like it was watching me. The noise moved closer to the side of the tent where my backpack was, and I could hear a faint scrape against the fabric. I wanted to scream or get up, but I didn't want to attract whatever it was. I stayed as still as I could, heart pounding, waiting for it to move away. After what felt like an eternity, the rustling stopped. The forest went silent again, except for the distant night sounds. I held my breath for a few more minutes, then slowly unzipped the tent and peeked outside. There was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been so close to me. The fire pit was cold and empty. I looked around carefully, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I couldn't stay in the tent. The feeling of being watched was too strong. I grabbed my flashlight and my small knife and decided to walk a little. The path back to the car was only a few hundred yards, but the trees made it hard to see far. Every step was careful and slow, my eyes darting to every shadow. I felt exposed, but I had to keep moving. When I finally reached the car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, the engine off, listening. The forest seemed to settle, the sounds returning to normal. The radio in the car was dead, no signal, and my phone showed no bars. I sat there until the sky started to lighten with the first signs of dawn. The morning brought a sense of relief. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more ordinary. I packed up quickly, keeping an eye out for any signs of what had been near me the night before. There was nothing. No prints, no disturbance. Just the soft dirt and leaves. I started the car and drove back down the narrow road, the sun rising behind me. The feeling of isolation faded with every mile. The world slowly came back. The distant hum of trucks, the signs of farms and houses, the small towns where people went about their daily lives. That night, and the days after, I kept thinking about what had happened. There was no ghost, no monster, no storybook creature. Just me, a stranger in the middle of nowhere, faced with the raw, quiet power of the wilderness. It was a reminder that the forest is its own world, indifferent and sometimes dangerous, filled with creatures and shadows that don't need to be explained with fantasy. I never went back to that clearing. I don't know if it was an animal or something else that came close that night, but I learned to respect how thin the line can be between calm and fear when you are truly alone in the wild. The experience stayed with me. A quiet warning that sometimes the scariest things are the things you can't see or understand, and that's enough. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle being alone. Not just the usual kind of alone, like being in a busy city by yourself or in a quiet apartment with a book. No, I mean truly alone, in the middle of nowhere, where the silence is so thick it presses in on you from every side. That's where I found myself one early autumn, on a dirt road miles from the nearest town or gas station. I had set out on a solo trip, mostly to clear my head and get away from the noise of daily life. My car was an old, beat-up pickup, reliable but nothing fancy. I'd packed just enough: some food, water, a tent, a sleeping bag, and a small first aid kit. No signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and the open sky. The plan was simple: drive until I found a spot that felt right, then camp for a few days, then head back. The road was rough and dusty, winding through dense pine forests and patches of dry grass. The leaves had started to turn yellow and orange, and the air was crisp but not cold. I liked the smell of the woods, earthy, fresh, with a hint of pine sap. Felt different here, like the world had slowed down. After driving for about 2 hours, I spotted a small clearing off to the side of the road. It wasn't much, a patch of dirt surrounded by tall trees, but it looked quiet and sheltered. I pulled over, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. No birds, no wind, just a stillness that made me aware of every tiny sound. The crunch of my boots on dry leaves, the faint rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was tucked between a few large trees for some protection. I arranged my sleeping bag inside and stacked my supplies nearby. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the branches. I sat down on a fallen log and took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to ease. As the light faded, I built a small fire. The crackling flames threw warm orange light onto the trees around me. I ate some canned beans and crackers, washing it down with cold water from my bottle. The fire's warmth was comforting against the cool air creeping in as night approached. Night in the middle of nowhere is a different kind of dark. It's not just the absence of light. It's a heavy, thick darkness that feels like it's swallowing everything whole. The stars were bright above me, clearer than I'd ever seen in the city, and I traced their patterns with my eyes. I could hear faint noises, an owl hooting far away, the occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, but nothing close or threatening. I lay back on the ground just outside my tent, staring up at the sky, letting the quiet wrap around me. My mind drifted, memories flickering like old movies. Things I'd left behind, worries I hadn't dealt with, decisions I was still unsure about. Out here, alone, everything felt sharper, more real. Around midnight, I noticed a different sound. Something steady, rhythmic, and soft. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the trees, but there was no breeze. Then I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves near my camp. I froze, my heart beating faster. The woods felt suddenly smaller, as if the darkness was closing in. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. The footsteps circled the clearing, coming closer, then moving away. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone or something was out there. Fear wasn't the first thing I felt. It was a deep, cold awareness. I reached slowly for the flashlight beside me, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. No eyes reflecting, no shadows moving. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned. I stayed awake, watching the fire die down to glowing embers. When morning came, I packed quickly and left. The road back felt longer, slower, and heavier. A few days later, I was back home, the noise and light of the city swallowing me up again. But the memory of those footsteps stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, not by something supernatural or wild, but by another person who didn't want to be seen. I thought about what it could mean. Someone else out there, maybe a hunter or someone lost or someone with a reason to hide. I decided to look up the area the next day. The clearing was part of a large stretch of forest, owned mostly by private landowners, and with no real patrols or visitors. It was a place people went to disappear for a while, sometimes for peace, sometimes for less innocent reasons. The footsteps that night had been a reminder. Even in the middle of nowhere, you're not always truly alone. The wilderness doesn't just hold nature. It holds people too. Some are friendly, some are lost, and some you just don't want to meet. That trip changed how I saw being alone. It taught me respect for the silence and the shadows, but also for the quiet presence of others, hidden just beyond sight. Now, when I think about the woods, I don't just see trees and stars. I see the stories they keep and the lives that brush past yours, unseen but always there. In the end, I learned that sometimes the scariest part of the middle of nowhere isn't the wilderness itself. It's the unknown people sharing that space with you, their intentions unclear, their presence a silent warning to stay alert. And that awareness stayed with me, a quiet caution I carry every time I head out into the wild again. I was alone, deep in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the endless stretch of dry land, scattered rocks, and a sky so wide it felt like it swallowed everything. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows from the few twisted trees that managed to grow out here. This place was so far from any town or road that even my phone had given up signal hours ago. I had no choice but to keep moving. I had come out here by myself, just me and my old truck, looking for a quiet place to clear my head. The noise of the city had been too much lately. The constant rush, the people, the never-ending buzz of lights and sounds. I thought maybe being out here would help. But I never expected how empty and heavy the silence would feel. The ground was hard and cracked under my boots, dust swirling around with every step. There was no breeze, just a dry stillness that made the air thick and hard to breathe. I could hear nothing but the crunch of my own footsteps and the faint rustle of dry grass bending under the weight of insects and small creatures moving through the dirt. I had packed just enough water and food for a day trip, not really planning to stay overnight. But now, as the sun fell behind the horizon, I realized I was miles away from any real road or shelter. The truck had broken down earlier in the day, a simple mechanical failure I couldn't fix on my own, leaving me stranded. No phone signal, no passing cars, nothing. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. The heat that had baked the earth during the day disappeared, replaced by a cold that seeped through my clothes and settled in my bones. I pulled my jacket tighter, feeling the weight of the loneliness around me. The stars came out one by one, bright and sharp in the clear sky, but they didn't bring comfort. They only reminded me how small and isolated I was. I tried to keep my mind busy, thinking through what I could do. The truck was useless without parts, and there was no way anyone would come looking for me this far out unless I made it back to the main road. That meant walking, but the night was dark, the ground uneven and full of hidden dangers. Rocks, holes, maybe even wild animals. I didn't want to risk it in the dark, but I couldn't stay here forever. I found a flat spot near a cluster of low bushes and decided to rest for a while, hoping to gather strength for the walk at first light. I took out my small water bottle, barely a few sips left, and drank slowly. I ate the last bit of trail mix I had packed. The hunger was dull but persistent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound seemed louder. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustling branches, the scraping of small creatures moving in the underbrush. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but I tried to push them aside. I focused on the rhythm of my breathing, trying to steady my shaking hands. As the hours passed, I watched the sky begin to lighten. The first faint glow of dawn spread across the horizon, softening the harsh edges of the night. I stood up, muscles stiff and sore, and started walking toward the direction I hoped would lead back to the main road. I had no real way to know if I was right, only the sun to guide me. The terrain was rough and uneven. My feet hurt from the rocky soil. My legs ached from the cold and lack of rest. But I kept moving, step by step, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. I counted the steps sometimes, just to keep my mind from wandering too far into fear. After hours of slow walking, I saw something ahead. A line of trees that looked thicker and taller than the bushes around me. That had to be near water, I thought. I was right. As I got closer, I heard the faint sound of running water, a small creek hidden among the trees. Relief washed over me. Water meant life. I could drink, rest, and maybe find a way to signal for help. I knelt by the edge of the creek and drank the cold water, the freshness washing away some of the exhaustion. I filled my empty bottle, planning to save it for later. As I rested, I looked around and noticed faint tire tracks in the dirt nearby. They weren't fresh, but they meant people had been here recently. That gave me hope. I followed the tracks slowly, careful not to lose them. The trees grew thicker, and the ground got softer, covered with fallen leaves and moss. The air smelled fresher here, less dry and heavy. Birds started singing in the branches above, a small comfort in the endless wilderness. After a while, I reached a dirt road, a narrow, unpaved track that cut through the forest. It was rough and bumpy, but it was a road. I knew it had to lead somewhere. I walked along it, feeling the sun's warmth return, drying the cold from my skin. Hours later, I heard the distant hum of a vehicle. My heart jumped. I stepped out into a small clearing and waved my arms frantically. The truck came into view, an old pickup like mine, driven by a man who slowed down when he saw me. He pulled over and asked if I was okay. I told him about my broken truck, no signal and getting lost. Without hesitation, he let me ride with him to the nearest town, where I could get help. On the way, I felt the weight of fear and loneliness lifting, replaced by a quiet gratitude. When I finally saw the signs of civilization, houses, power lines, people, I realized how fragile that silence in the middle of nowhere had been. It was peaceful, yes, but it was also dangerous and unforgiving. Being alone out there meant depending entirely on yourself and sometimes luck. That day, I learned how easy it was to get lost in more ways than one, and how important it was to prepare and respect the land. Most of all, I understood how much we need connection, even if it's just a friendly face in a truck on a lonely road. The middle of nowhere isn't just a place on the map. It's a test of patience, strength, and hope. And sometimes, it's the place where you realize how much you want to get back. I ended up in that place because I wanted quiet. I wanted to be far from people, far from noise, far from everything that felt heavy in my life at the time. I picked a spot on the map that barely had a name. No towns close by, no main roads, just a thin dirt road cutting through miles of dry land and trees. I packed my car with basic supplies, food, water, a tent, tools, and extra fuel. I told myself it was just going to be a simple trip, a few days alone in the middle of nowhere to clear my head. The drive itself already felt strange. The farther I went, the worse the road became. Pavement turned to gravel, gravel turned to dirt, and then the dirt road started to fade into something that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Tall grass brushed the bottom of my car. Trees leaned in close on both sides, blocking out the sky in places. There were no signs, no fences, no houses. My phone lost signal long before I reached the spot I had marked. I remember noticing how quiet it became when I turned the engine off. Not peaceful quiet, but a heavy quiet that felt like pressure on my ears. I set up my tent near a small clearing. The ground was uneven and dry, cracked in places, with rocks buried just under the surface. The air smelled like dust and old leaves. I could hear insects, but no birds. That stood out to me. Even in remote places, there are usually birds. I brushed it off and focused on setting up camp. The sun was already starting to lower, and shadows stretched long between the trees. As night came, the temperature dropped fast. I sat by a small fire and ate canned food, listening to the wind move through the trees. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. Branches snapping far away, leaves shifting, something heavy moving through the brush now and then. I told myself it was animals. That made sense. This was their land, not mine. When I finally lay down in my tent, sleep didn't come easily. The ground pressed into my back no matter how I shifted. The air felt thick, like it was harder to breathe. At some point during the night, I woke up for no clear reason. My body felt tense, like it had been pulled out of a deep sleep by instinct. I listened closely. There was a sound outside, slow and steady, moving through the trees. It wasn't fast like a deer or small animal. It was heavy, deliberate. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide. The sound circled the clearing once, then faded away. I stayed awake for a long time after that, staring into the darkness of the tent, waiting for it to come back. It didn't, and eventually exhaustion pulled me under. In the morning, the place looked different. Not brighter or safer, just more exposed. I stepped outside and noticed marks in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Deep impressions, not clear enough to tell exactly what made them, but large enough to unsettle me. They didn't look like normal animal tracks. They were uneven, dragged in places, as if something heavy had been moving without caring where it stepped. I decided to explore a bit, thinking daylight would calm my nerves. I walked along the dirt road, keeping track of my direction. The trees felt closer together the farther I went. The forest swallowed sound. Even my footsteps felt muted. After maybe 20 minutes, I came across something that didn't belong. An old wooden structure, half collapsed, hidden behind brush. It looked like a small shack or storage building, long abandoned. The wood was gray and split, nails rusted, the roof caved in. Inside, there was nothing useful, just dirt, broken boards, and scraps of fabric that might have once been bags or clothes. What bothered me was the smell, old, sour, and human. Not like rot from animals, but like a place people had once stayed and left in a hurry. I didn't stay long. I didn't want to think about why it was there. When I got back to camp, something felt off immediately. My tent was still standing, but the area around it looked disturbed. Rocks I remembered placing near the fire pit were scattered. One of my water bottles was missing. I knew I hadn't moved it. I searched the clearing and found it a short distance away, crushed slightly, like it had been squeezed by something strong. Fear settled in my stomach then. Not panic yet, but a clear signal that I shouldn't be there anymore. I started packing up, moving fast but trying not to make noise. Every few seconds, I stopped and listened. The forest felt like it was watching me. The same heavy quiet pressed in again. As I loaded my car, I heard movement close by. Not running, not hiding, just moving. Branches bent and snapped slowly. I didn't look directly toward the sound. I didn't want to. I finished packing, hands shaking, and got into the car. When I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to start. That moment was the worst. Sitting there, stuck with that sound getting closer. I tried again and again. Finally, the engine turned over and came to life. I didn't wait. I drove forward, not caring about scraping branches or rocks. The road felt longer than before. Every bend made me expect something to step out in front of the car. At one point, I saw movement in the trees to my left. Tall, dark, upright. It stayed just far enough away that I couldn't fully make it out. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. When I finally reached a paved road, relief hit me so hard I had to pull over. My hands were cramped from gripping the wheel. I sat there for a long time, breathing, letting the normal sounds of distant traffic and wind settle my nerves. I went straight home and didn't tell anyone the full story. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to say it out loud. I cleaned my gear and sold most of it a week later. I stopped going to places that had no people, no lights, no help nearby. What stays with me isn't the fear of some unknown creature. It's the clear feeling that I had stepped into a place I was not meant to be, a place that didn't care whether I understood it or not. I left, and that was the only reason I was able to sit in my car afterward, alive, knowing that some parts of the world are empty for a reason, and they are better left that way. I was alone because I chose to be. That is the part people always miss when I tell the story later. I wasn't lost, and I wasn't running from anything. I drove out there on purpose, far past the last gas station, past the broken fence lines and rusted mailboxes, until the road turned to dirt and the dirt turned to nothing that felt official. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be somewhere the world couldn't reach me for a few days. The place wasn't marked on any map I owned. It was just a stretch of land I had seen once years earlier while driving at night. A wide open area surrounded by low hills and dead trees, with no houses, no power lines, and no cell service. I packed light but carefully. Water, canned food, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight with extra batteries, a knife, and my old truck that had never failed me before. The weather was clear when I left, dry air and a pale blue sky that made everything look farther away than it really was. The drive itself took hours. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. No radio stations came in after a while, just static that rose and fell with the hills. The road narrowed until grass started growing down the center, scraping the underside of the truck. I remember thinking how strange it felt to be moving forward while everything around me looked untouched, like I was crossing into a place that hadn't noticed time passing. When I finally stopped, the sun was already low. The land was flat where I parked, with hard dirt and scattered rocks. The hills around me blocked most of the wind. It felt still, heavy, like the air was holding its breath. I set up my tent while there was still light, hammering the stakes into the ground and making sure everything was tight. I checked the truck twice before locking it, even though there was no one around to worry about. As night came in, the temperature dropped fast. The sky went from orange to purple to black, and the stars came out sharp and bright in a way you never see near towns. There were no distant lights, no traffic noise, no hum of electricity, just the sound of my own movements and the dry ground under my boots. I ate quietly, sitting on a rock, and watched my breath fog in the cold air. That first night was calm, but not comfortable. Every small sound felt louder than it should have been. Wind brushing the tent, something small moving across the dirt, the fabric shifting when I turned over. I told myself this was normal, that being alone always makes the mind stretch things out. Still, I slept lightly, waking up often and checking the time on my watch even though it didn't matter. The second day was different. The sky stayed overcast, a dull gray that flattened everything. I walked the area to pass time, staying within sight of the truck. The ground showed signs of old tire tracks, faint and nearly erased, but enough to prove someone else had been there before me. There were also scraps of metal half buried in the dirt, too rusted to identify. No trash, no fresh footprints, nothing recent. Just old marks, like reminders that this place had been used and then forgotten. By late afternoon, I started to feel watched. Not in a dramatic way, not like something was about to jump out. It was more subtle than that. Pressure. The sense that I was no longer alone in the way I had been the day before. I stopped walking and stood still for a long time, listening. There was nothing obvious. No footsteps, no voices, no engines. Just silence that felt thicker than before. That night, I heard movement outside the tent. Slow, careful movement. Not the scattered steps of an animal, but something steady, circling. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening as the sound shifted from one side of the tent to the other. The ground made soft, crunching noises, deliberate and spaced out. Whoever it was stayed just far enough away that I couldn't see a shadow through the fabric. I didn't reach for the zipper. I didn't call out. I stayed frozen, hoping the lack of movement would make me invisible. The sounds went on for what felt like a long time, then stopped. The silence afterward was worse. I waited until my muscles ached before I finally moved again. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, staring into the dark, counting my breaths until the sky began to lighten. At dawn, I stepped out of the tent and saw fresh boot prints in the dirt around my camp. Large prints, deep, made by someone wearing heavy footwear. They circled the tent once, then led away toward the hills. I followed them only a short distance before stopping. The prints were clear and confident, not rushed, not sloppy. Whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. I packed up immediately. Every movement felt rushed even though I forced myself to stay calm. The air felt wrong, like it was pressing down on me. When I turned the key in the truck, it took a second longer than usual to start, and that second felt like a lifetime. As I drove away, I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. There was nothing. The road back felt longer than the drive in. The land seemed stretched out, the turns unfamiliar. I didn't relax until I reached pavement and saw the first faded road sign. By the time I got cell service again, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I never went back there. I didn't report it, didn't try to investigate further. The marks, the movement, the feeling of being measured in the dark were enough. Some places are empty for a reason, and sometimes the quiet isn't peace. Sometimes it's a warning, waiting patiently for someone who thinks being alone means being safe. I drove for hours without seeing another car. The road slowly changed from cracked pavement to loose gravel, and then to a narrow dirt path that looked like it had not been used in years. Trees closed in on both sides, tall and thick, blocking most of the sky. My phone lost signal long before that, but I kept driving because the map I printed earlier showed this road as the only way to reach the old land I had bought cheap months ago. It was supposed to be empty, far from everything, a place where no one bothered you. That was exactly why I wanted it. I parked near a clearing just before sunset. The air felt heavy and still, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound stand out. I could hear insects buzzing and something moving slowly in the brush far away. I grabbed my bag, a flashlight, food, water, and a small tent. I planned to stay only one night, just to see the land and head back in the morning. The clearing looked untouched. Grass was tall and uneven, with patches of bare dirt. Trees circled the area like a wall. I noticed old tire marks half buried in the soil, faded but still there. They looked too wide to be from normal cars. I told myself it was probably from logging years ago. Still, the marks made me uneasy. I set up the tent as the light faded. The sky turned a dull gray, then dark blue. The forest seemed to grow louder as night came. Every sound felt closer, sharper. I ate some food and sat quietly, listening. The smell of damp earth and leaves filled the air. It felt raw and real, like the world had stripped itself down to nothing but trees and dirt. Later, while adjusting the tent stakes, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. About 30 feet away, at the edge of the trees, the grass was pressed down in a wide path leading into the forest. It looked fresh, not made by animals. It was too wide and too straight. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. I went inside the tent and zipped it shut. I kept the flashlight in my hand. Sleep did not come easy. Every small noise pulled me back to full awareness. Leaves shifted. Twigs snapped. At some point, I heard slow, heavy movement circling the clearing. Whatever it was moved with purpose, not rushing, not careless. It stayed just out of sight, never stepping into the open. My chest felt tight. I stayed still, barely breathing. I did not hear voices or footsteps, just the sound of weight pressing into soil and leaves. It went on for a long time, then stopped. The silence afterward felt worse than the noise. Sometime in the early morning hours, rain started falling lightly. The sound of it hitting the tent helped calm me, and I eventually drifted into a shallow sleep. When I woke up, the rain had stopped. Pale morning light filtered through the tent walls. I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. The clearing looked different in daylight. Mud covered the ground, making details clearer. Near the pressed-down path, I saw deep boot prints. They were large and sunk deep into the soil. More prints circled the clearing. Whoever made them had walked around my tent during the night. My mouth went dry. I packed my things quickly, hands shaking. As I loaded everything into my car, I noticed something else. My car had fresh mud smeared along the side, and one of the tires looked slightly deflated. Not flat, but not right either. Felt intentional. I tried starting the car. The engine turned over but struggled. After a few seconds, it started. I did not waste time. I pulled away from the clearing and followed the dirt road back toward the main road. About 10 minutes in, the road narrowed even more. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, forcing me to slow down. That was when I saw an old truck parked off to the side, half hidden behind trees. It was rusted but not abandoned. The ground around it was torn up with fresh tracks. My heart pounded. I drove past without stopping. A few minutes later, I checked the mirror and saw the truck pulling onto the road behind me. It stayed far back at first, then slowly closed the distance. The road was too narrow to turn around. Trees pressed in tight on both sides. The truck followed me for miles. Every time I sped up, it sped up. Every time I slowed, it stayed just far enough to avoid dust. I kept my eyes forward, hands locked on the wheel. The tire held together just enough. Finally, the dirt road connected to cracked pavement. As soon as my tires hit it, the truck slowed and stopped. I kept driving without looking back. I did not stop until I reached a small town hours later. I went straight to a mechanic. He checked the tire and found a sharp metal piece jammed into it, placed in a way that caused slow damage instead of an instant flat. He also noticed scratch marks near the fuel cap, like someone had tried to open it. I never went back to that land. I sold it for almost nothing a few weeks later. I did not tell the buyer much, just that it was remote and undeveloped. I still think about that night sometimes, not because of what I saw, but because of how careful it all felt. Whoever was out there did not rush. They watched, they waited, and they made sure I understood that I did not belong there. I learned something important from that place. The middle of nowhere is not empty. Sometimes it already belongs to someone, and sometimes they do not want witnesses. I drove out there because I needed space and because I thought being alone would help me clear my head. I picked a random stretch of land on the map where the roads stopped having names and turned into thin gray lines. The place was hours away from anything that mattered. No towns nearby, no gas stations, no cell signal according to the map. Just empty land, trees, and dirt roads. I packed light but careful. Water, food, a sleeping bag, a small tent, a flashlight, a knife, extra fuel, and a paper map. I told myself I would stay 2 nights and leave. Nothing extreme, just quiet. The drive itself felt like a slow step away from everything familiar. The highway turned into a 2-lane road, then into a cracked road with weeds growing through it. Eventually, the pavement ended. My tires rolled onto dirt and gravel, and the sound changed. It was louder and rougher, like the ground was warning me I was leaving normal places behind. Trees crowded closer to the road. Tall, thin ones with dark trunks and branches that tangled together above me. The sky was already turning dull and gray, even though it was early afternoon. I followed the map until I reached a clearing marked by nothing at all. No sign, no marker, just a wide open patch of land surrounded by forest. I parked the car and shut the engine off. The silence hit me right away. No distant traffic, no voices, no machines. Just wind moving through leaves and the faint sound of insects. It felt heavier than silence back home, like it pressed against my ears. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing so I could still see the trees. The ground was uneven and hard, and I had to move rocks out of the way with my boot. My hands got dirty fast. I noticed old tire tracks near the edge of the clearing, half covered by dirt and leaves. They looked old, but not ancient. I told myself it probably belonged to hunters or workers passing through months ago. That thought sat in my head longer than it should have. As evening came, the light changed in a way that made the place feel smaller. Shadows stretched out and filled the open space. The forest looked thicker, darker. I cooked a simple meal and ate it standing up, scanning the trees without really meaning to. The smell of food faded fast, swallowed by cold air. When the sun went down, it went down all at once. There was no slow fade, just darkness sliding in. I sat by myself with the flashlight off for a while, letting my eyes adjust. The sounds changed after dark. More movement, more rustling. Not loud, but constant. Something was always moving just out of sight. I reminded myself that this was normal, that animals owned this place. Not me. Still, I kept the flashlight close. When I finally went into the tent, sleep did not come easy. Every sound felt sharp. A branch snapping somewhere far away. Leaves shifting. Wind brushing against the fabric. At one point, I heard something heavy moving through the brush. Slow, steady steps. Too slow to be a deer running, too heavy to be something small. I lay still, holding my breath, listening until the sound faded. I told myself it moved on. I did not sleep much after that. Morning came pale and cold. The sky was cloudy, and the forest looked drained of color. I stepped out of the tent and stretched, trying to shake off the bad night. That was when I saw the ground near my car. Fresh tire tracks, clear and deep, pressed into the dirt. They had not been there the day before. They came from the same road I used and curved toward the clearing, then stopped not far from where I slept. I walked closer and crouched down. The edges were sharp, not worn down. Whoever made them came here during the night. There were footprints too. Heavy boots, large size. They circled the clearing once. Not rushed, careful. I felt my stomach tighten. No one had come to talk to me. No one announced themselves. They came, looked around, and left. I packed my things slower than I should have, checking the forest again and again. I told myself not to panic. Maybe it was a ranger or someone lost. Still, I decided I would leave that afternoon instead of staying another night. I needed daylight. Before leaving, I walked a short distance into the trees to use the bathroom. The forest felt different up close. The air was damp and smelled like wet soil and rot. That was when I noticed pieces of trash scattered deeper in. Empty cans, torn plastic, old food wrappers. Someone had been using this place regularly, far more often than I liked. When I got back to the clearing, something else was wrong. The hood of my car was warm. I had not started it since yesterday. That meant someone touched it recently. My hands shook as I checked the doors. They were still locked. Nothing was missing, but the feeling stayed with me, thick and heavy. I got in and started the engine, turned over slowly, then caught. Relief washed through me, sharp and sudden. I pulled onto the dirt road and started driving back the way I came. After a few minutes, I saw something in the mirror. A vehicle, far back, but moving. It followed the road exactly the way I did. Same speed, same turns. I sped up. The road narrowed and twisted, and dust filled the air behind me. The vehicle stayed there, never getting closer, never falling behind. Just there, watching. My hands were tight on the wheel, my shoulders stiff. I told myself to stay calm, to keep control. After nearly half an hour, the road split. One path led deeper into the forest. The other led toward the main road. I took the main road without slowing down. I did not look back again. I did not stop until I hit pavement and saw a faded road sign with a town name on it. I drove straight to a gas station and parked under the bright lights. Only then did I let myself breathe fully. My hands were numb. My head hurt. I stayed there for a long time before driving home. I never went back to that place. I did not report it because I had nothing solid to report. No faces. No words. Just signs and feelings. But I learned something clear from that trip. Being alone in the middle of nowhere does not always mean being the only one there. Sometimes it just means being the easiest one to watch. I drove out there because I wanted silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own breathing. The place was far from anything marked on a map, a stretch of broken dirt roads and dry hills that looked the same in every direction. I had picked it at random while scrolling through satellite images, a blank patch with no buildings nearby and no names attached to it. That alone felt like permission to disappear for a few days. The road stopped being a road after the last rusted cattle gate. From there it turned into loose gravel and then into nothing but two faint tire lines cutting through weeds. I kept going until even those faded out. When I shut the engine off, the sound felt too loud for a place like that. When the engine died, the quiet rushed in so fast it almost felt physical. I set up my small camp near a dry creek bed. The ground was hard and uneven, scattered with old bones bleached white by the sun. Some were from small animals, some bigger. I told myself it was normal for a place this remote. The air smelled like dust and old grass. There was no wind, no birds, no insects, just stillness. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I cooked my food quickly and cleaned everything right away. I did not want to attract animals. When darkness settled in, it felt thick, like the world had shrunk down to the weak circle of my headlamp. Beyond that light was nothing but black space. I lay in my tent listening to my own heartbeat and the faint ringing in my ears that comes with deep quiet. Sometime after midnight, I woke up for no clear reason. My body felt tense, like it had reacted before my mind caught up. I lay still, listening. At first there was nothing. Then I heard a sound that did not belong there. It was not an animal call. It was not wind. It was the slow scrape of something moving over dry ground, stopping, then starting again. The sound stayed just outside the reach of my light. It circled without rhythm. Whoever or whatever it was moved carefully, as if aware of the noise it made. My mouth went dry. I stayed completely still, focusing on breathing quietly. The sound eventually faded, moving farther away until it blended back into silence. Morning came gray and cold. I told myself the sound could have been an animal dragging something. That explanation felt thin, but it was better than the alternative. When I stepped out of the tent, I saw fresh marks in the dirt. They were boot prints. Not old ones, not weathered. Sharp edges. Someone had walked around my camp during the night. The prints did not approach the tent directly. They made wide circles, careful and slow. There were no other tracks leading away in a straight line, just looping paths that disappeared into hard ground. My stomach tightened. I was miles from anyone, and someone had been watching me sleep. I packed up fast but forced myself to be quiet and steady. Panic wastes time. I checked my vehicle. One of the tires had lost pressure. Not completely flat, but enough to make driving risky. There were small cuts along the sidewall, shallow but deliberate. That took away the last excuse my mind had been holding on to. I tried to stay logical. Whoever did this knew I was alone. They had not approached openly. They wanted me stuck or at least delayed. I filled the tire as best I could and decided to leave immediately. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing on a ridge or following in another vehicle. There was nothing, just empty land and the narrow strip of ground ahead of me. After a few miles, the tire gave out completely. The sound of rubber tearing echoed too loudly. I pulled over and got out. The spare was already damaged. The same careful cuts hidden on the inner side where I would not have noticed at first glance. That meant someone had been at my vehicle long enough to plan this. I started walking. Staying with the vehicle felt wrong. It was too obvious, too exposed. I took only what I could carry and headed toward a line of low hills, hoping to gain height and see something useful. The sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down hard. Sweat soaked through my clothes. Every sound made me flinch. I found more signs as I walked. Broken twigs placed across narrow paths. Scratches on rocks at waist height. Not random damage, but markers. Someone moved through this land often. Someone knew it well. The feeling of being watched never left. It was constant, like pressure on my back. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat burned. I reached a ridge and finally saw a dirt service road far in the distance. That sight felt like rescue. I pushed myself harder, moving downhill fast, not caring about noise anymore. The land opened up into a wide flat area with old equipment rusting in place, leftovers from some abandoned work site. Near one of the machines, I found a small shelter made from scrap metal and tarps. Inside were supplies, water containers, food wrappers, tools laid out neatly. This was not an emergency camp. It was lived in. Recently, the realization hit hard and cold. This was not random. I had wandered into someone else's chosen nowhere. I did not stay. I kept moving until my legs felt like they would fail. When I reached the road, it felt unreal, like stepping out of a nightmare into a different world. I walked along it until a truck eventually passed. I flagged it down without hesitation. I left that place behind me, but it did not stay there. For weeks after, I woke up at night convinced I heard movement just beyond my walls. The ending was clear, even if it was not comforting. Some places are empty on purpose, not because no one is there, but because someone wants it that way. I survived by leaving when I did. I do not go looking for silence anymore. I drove for hours without seeing another car. The road slowly changed from cracked pavement to loose gravel, and then to a narrow dirt path that looked like it had not been used in years. Trees closed in on both sides, tall and thick, blocking most of the sky. My phone lost signal long before that, but I kept driving because the map I printed earlier showed this road as the only way to reach the old land I had bought cheap months ago. It was supposed to be empty, far from everything, a place where no one bothered you. That was exactly why I wanted it. I parked near a clearing just before sunset. The air felt heavy and still, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound stand out. I could hear insects buzzing and something moving slowly in the brush far away. I grabbed my bag, a flashlight, food, water, and a small tent. I planned to stay only one night, just to see the land and head back in the morning. The clearing looked untouched. Grass was tall and uneven, with patches of bare dirt. Trees circled the area like a wall. I noticed old tire marks half buried in the soil, faded but still there. They looked too wide to be from normal cars. I told myself it was probably from logging years ago. Still, the marks made me uneasy. I set up the tent as the light faded. The sky turned a dull gray, then dark blue. The forest seemed to grow louder as night came. Every sound felt closer, sharper. I ate some food and sat quietly, listening. The smell of damp earth and leaves filled the air. It felt raw and real, like the world had stripped itself down to nothing but trees and dirt. Later, while adjusting the tent stakes, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. About 30 feet away, at the edge of the trees, the grass was pressed down in a wide path leading into the forest. It looked fresh, not made by animals. It was too wide and too straight. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. I went inside the tent and zipped it shut. I kept the flashlight in my hand. Sleep did not come easy. Every small noise pulled me back to full awareness. Leaves shifted. Twigs snapped. At some point, I heard slow, heavy movement circling the clearing. Whatever it was moved with purpose, not rushing, not careless. It stayed just out of sight, never stepping into the open. My chest felt tight. I stayed still, barely breathing. I did not hear voices or footsteps, just the sound of weight pressing into soil and leaves. It went on for a long time, then stopped. The silence afterward felt worse than the noise. Sometime in the early morning hours, rain started falling lightly. The sound of it hitting the tent helped calm me, and I eventually drifted into a shallow sleep. When I woke up, the rain had stopped. Pale morning light filtered through the tent walls. I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. The clearing looked different in daylight. Mud covered the ground, making details clearer. Near the pressed-down path, I saw deep boot prints. They were large and sunk deep into the soil. More prints circled the clearing. Whoever made them had walked around my tent during the night. My mouth went dry. I packed my things quickly, hands shaking. As I loaded everything into my car, I noticed something else. My car had fresh mud smeared along the side, and one of the tires looked slightly deflated. Not flat, but not right either. Felt intentional. I tried starting the car. The engine turned over but struggled. After a few seconds, it started. I did not waste time. I pulled away from the clearing and followed the dirt road back toward the main road. About 10 minutes in, the road narrowed even more. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, forcing me to slow down. That was when I saw an old truck parked off to the side, half hidden behind trees. It was rusted but not abandoned. The ground around it was torn up with fresh tracks. My heart pounded. I drove past without stopping. A few minutes later, I checked the mirror and saw the truck pulling onto the road behind me. It stayed far back at first, then slowly closed the distance. The road was too narrow to turn around. Trees pressed in tight on both sides. The truck followed me for miles. Every time I sped up, it sped up. Every time I slowed, it stayed just far enough to avoid dust. I kept my eyes forward, hands locked on the wheel. The tire held together just enough. Finally, the dirt road connected to cracked pavement. As soon as my tires hit it, the truck slowed and stopped. I kept driving without looking back. I did not stop until I reached a small town hours later. I went straight to a mechanic. He checked the tire and found a sharp metal piece jammed into it, placed in a way that caused slow damage instead of an instant flat. He also noticed scratch marks near the fuel cap, like someone had tried to open it. I never went back to that land. I sold it for almost nothing a few weeks later. I did not tell the buyer much, just that it was remote and undeveloped. I still think about that night sometimes, not because of what I saw, but because of how careful it all felt. Whoever was out there did not rush. They watched, they waited, and they made sure I understood that I did not belong there. I learned something important from that place. The middle of nowhere is not empty. Sometimes it already belongs to someone, and sometimes they do not want witnesses. I took the job because it paid cash and because no one else wanted it. It was listed online as short-term property maintenance for a piece of land far from town. The posting was vague, just said middle of nowhere, access road included, cabin on site, basic work like clearing debris, checking fences, and staying on the land for a week to keep an eye on things. I was between jobs and tired of being around people, so the idea of being alone felt like a break instead of a risk. The drive itself should have warned me. The paved road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to a narrow stretch of ground that barely looked like a road at all. Trees leaned inward the farther I went, blocking most of the daylight. My phone lost service about an hour before I reached the place. The GPS froze and I followed printed directions I had written down, counting turns and miles the old way. By the time I arrived, it felt like I had crossed into a place that didn't expect visitors. The cabin was small and old but solid. One room, a tiny bathroom, and a generator shed out back. There were no nearby houses, no power lines, no signs of recent activity. Just trees, uneven ground, and silence that felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my ears. The owner had stocked the place with canned food, water, fuel, and tools. Everything looked untouched, almost staged, like someone had prepared it carefully and then never came back. The first day went fine. I cleared fallen branches from the fence line and checked the generator. I walked the perimeter of the land, which took hours because it was larger than it looked on the map. There were old tire tracks in some places, mostly half filled with leaves and dirt, but still visible. I told myself they were probably from years ago. That night, I locked the door more out of habit than fear and slept hard. The second day was when I noticed things that didn't sit right. Near the far end of the property, I found a spot where the ground had been pressed down recently, like something heavy had been dragged or parked there. There were no clear footprints, just disturbed soil and broken plants. I followed the marks for a while, but they faded into rocky ground. I felt exposed standing out there, so I headed back to the cabin. Later that evening, I realized some of my food had been moved. Not taken, just shifted. A can that I was sure I had left on the shelf was now on the table. The door was still locked, the windows intact. I told myself I had forgotten that being tired can mess with memory. Still, I made sure everything was where I thought it should be before going to sleep. Over the next 2 days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't a sudden panic, more like a slow pressure that never went away. I would be working outside and suddenly feel the urge to turn around, like someone was behind me. Every time there was nothing there. No sound, no movement, just trees and wind. I started keeping the generator running longer at night just to hear something other than the quiet. On the 4th morning, I found boot prints near the cabin. They were fresh, pressed clearly into the damp soil. They didn't match my boots. They circled the cabin once and then stopped near the back wall, close to the generator shed. I stood there staring at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. There were no other tracks leading away, like whoever made them had vanished. I checked the shed and found nothing missing, but the door wasn't latched the way I remembered leaving it. I packed my things that afternoon. I told myself I was being smart, not scared, but my hands shook as I loaded the truck. When I turned the key, the engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead, even though it had been fine the day before. I checked under the hood and saw that one of the cables had been loosened by hand. That was the moment it stopped feeling like bad luck. I went back inside and locked the door. I rationed the fuel and food, planning to leave at first light when I could walk back down the road and hope for service. That night was the longest of my life. I heard movement outside, slow and careful, like someone trying not to make noise. Leaves crunched softly, then stopped. Hours passed like that, with sounds coming and going. I stayed still, barely breathing, staring at the door until my eyes burned. When morning came, I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside. The yard was quiet. No tracks, no signs of anyone being there. I started walking down the road, keeping a steady pace, not looking back. After about an hour, I found a small clearing with an old hunting blind tucked into the trees. Inside it were food wrappers, empty bottles, and a sleeping bag. It was clear someone had been living there for a while, watching the road, watching the cabin. I kept walking until my phone picked up a weak signal. I called for help and stayed on the line until I saw a truck coming. Later, after I was safe, I learned the land had a history. The owner had bought it cheap after previous caretakers left early, always with vague excuses. One of them had reported someone living off-grid nearby, but no one ever found them. The land was remote enough that someone could disappear out there without trying very hard. I never went back. The job wasn't worth the money, and the memory still follows me. What scares me most isn't what I imagined in the dark, but what I know was real. Someone was out there, close enough to touch the walls while I slept, patient enough to wait and smart enough to stay hidden. The middle of nowhere isn't empty. Sometimes it's just quiet enough for someone else to live there without being seen. I was driving alone through a stretch of land that barely felt like part of the map anymore. The road had narrowed into cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through the sides, and my phone had lost signal hours ago. I had taken the route because it looked shorter, a thin gray line cutting through empty land on the navigation app before it went dead. Fields turned into dry hills, and the hills turned into nothing but dirt, rocks, and scattered trees that looked sick and bent from years of wind. The sun was already low when my car started acting strange. The engine light came on first, glowing dull orange. Then the car began to shake in a way I had never felt before. I slowed down, hoping it would calm itself, but it only got worse. The road ahead was empty in both directions. No houses, no lights, no signs. When the engine finally died, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise ever did. I sat there for a long time with my hands still on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sound of the cooling engine. The air outside looked still, like even the wind had decided to stop moving. I stepped out of the car and the smell of hot metal mixed with dry dirt filled my nose. The road stretched straight ahead, disappearing into darkness, and behind me it did the same. There was no point walking in either direction without knowing how far help might be. A few hundred feet off the road, I noticed an old structure barely visible between the trees. It looked like a small house or maybe a hunting cabin, leaning slightly to one side. The roof was uneven, and one corner looked like it had sunk into the ground. It wasn't comforting, but it was shelter, and the sun was almost gone. I grabbed my bag from the car and walked toward it, my footsteps loud against the quiet land. Up close, the place looked worse. The wood was gray and cracked, and the windows were dark and dusty. The door was hanging crooked on its hinges, pushed open just enough to show darkness inside. The smell coming from the place was old and stale, like damp wood and rot. I stood there for a while, listening, trying to hear any sign of life. There was nothing. No insects, no animals, no movement at all. Inside, the floor creaked under my weight. The room was small, just one main space with a table, a broken chair, and a rusted stove. Old cans sat on a shelf, their labels faded and peeling. The walls were marked with deep scratches, long lines running up and down the wood, uneven and rough. I tried not to think too hard about how they got there. I told myself it was animals, maybe tools, maybe years of damage. As night settled in, the darkness outside pressed against the windows. I used my flashlight sparingly, not wanting to drain the battery. The silence became uncomfortable, like my ears were straining to hear something that wasn't there. Every small sound I made felt too loud. My breathing, my shifting weight, the soft scrape of my shoe against the floor all felt like mistakes. Sometime later, I noticed tracks in the dirt near the door. They were deep and uneven, not like normal animal tracks I had seen before. They looked heavy, like something had dragged itself or paced back and forth. The dirt was disturbed in circles, as if whatever made them had spent a lot of time right outside the door. The thought sat in my chest and refused to move. As the hours passed, I began to feel watched. There was no sound to prove it, no movement in the trees, but the feeling stayed. I kept my flashlight aimed toward the door, my body tense, ready for something I couldn't name. At one point, I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. It was slow and deliberate, not like wind. The wall creaked slightly, and dust fell from the ceiling. I stayed completely still. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my throat. Whatever was outside moved again, this time closer to the door. The handle shifted slightly, just enough to make the metal scrape. It didn't open. It didn't need to. The presence alone was enough to make my skin crawl. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the pressure outside faded. The sounds stopped. I waited much longer than felt necessary before I dared to move again. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, holding my breath every time the cabin made a noise of its own. When the sky finally began to lighten, I felt a small amount of relief. Morning didn't make the place feel safe, but it made it feel possible to move again. I stepped outside and saw more tracks than before. They circled the cabin, crossed over each other, and led off into the trees. Whatever made them had been close all night. I walked back to the road and followed it on foot, hoping daylight would bring help. After what felt like miles, I saw a truck approaching. The driver stopped when he saw me and helped get my car towed later that day. I never told him about the cabin or the tracks. I didn't want to explain something I couldn't fully understand myself. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the area on old maps and records. The road wasn't supposed to be used anymore. The cabin wasn't listed anywhere. The land had once been used for mining, then abandoned after several accidents and disappearances. No details were given, just dates and names that stopped appearing after a certain year. I don't take shortcuts anymore. I don't trust empty roads, no matter how quiet or harmless they look. That night in the middle of nowhere taught me that some places aren't empty at all. They're just waiting, and surviving them doesn't mean you understand them. It only means you were lucky enough to leave. I drove out there because I wanted to be alone for a few days, not because I was chasing anything exciting. The road kept thinning until it stopped being a road and turned into a long stretch of cracked gravel cutting through empty land. There were no houses, no fences, no signs, just dry grass and low hills that looked the same in every direction. My phone lost signal hours before I reached the spot I had marked on an old offline map. That was fine with me at the time. I told myself that being unreachable was part of the point. I parked near what used to be a fire access path and walked the rest of the way with my backpack. The air felt dry and heavy, and there was no wind. Even the insects were quiet. I found a flat patch of ground near a line of dead trees and set up my tent slowly, checking everything twice. I had learned the hard way that small mistakes feel bigger when there is nobody around to help. By the time the sun dropped behind the hills, the temperature fell fast, and the silence started to feel thick, like something you could lean against. That first night was calm. Too calm. I barely slept, not because I was scared, but because my body would not settle. Every small sound stood out. A rock shifting somewhere far away sounded close. My own breathing felt loud inside the tent. When morning came, I felt tired but relieved. Daylight made the place look harmless. Just dirt, grass, and old trees with no leaves. Nothing special. I spent the day walking in slow circles around my camp, always keeping it in sight. I noticed things that bothered me in a quiet way. There were tire tracks that looked recent, not old enough to have faded. There were boot prints near a dry creek bed that were not mine. I told myself it was probably someone passing through days earlier. That explanation worked until I noticed the same boot pattern closer to my tent later in the afternoon. The ground was hard, so the prints were faint, but they were there. I packed my things tighter that evening and moved my knife and flashlight within reach. I still did not think I was in danger. I thought I was letting the quiet mess with my head. That night, I woke up to a sound that did not belong to the land. It was steady and dull, like something being dragged slowly across dirt. It stopped when I held my breath. After a long time, I convinced myself it was an animal and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I found a long mark in the dirt leading past my tent, deep enough to mean wait. There were no clear tracks beside it, just the line itself. I walked along it until it faded into rocky ground. My stomach felt tight, but I still tried to stay logical. People do strange things in remote places. That thought kept coming back, and every time it did, it felt worse. By the third day, I stopped enjoying being alone. I stopped exploring and stayed near my tent. I ate less. I kept scanning the land without really knowing what I was looking for. Late in the afternoon, I saw movement near the dead trees. It was not fast. It was careful. A shape low to the ground, then gone. I waited a long time watching the same spot, but nothing else happened. That night was the worst. I heard footsteps. Not random, not light. Slow, measured steps that stopped and started again. They circled the tent once. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, staring at the thin fabric inches from my face. I did not hear voices. I did not hear animals. Just steps and the sound of something brushing against dry grass. After a long time, it moved away. I did not sleep after that. When the sky started to lighten, I packed everything as fast as I could without making noise. My hands shook the whole time. I kept expecting to see someone standing just outside my view. When I finally started walking back toward the car, I felt exposed in every direction. The land was too open. There was nowhere to hide. Halfway there, I saw the car and felt a brief sense of relief. That relief died when I noticed the rear tire was flat. Not punctured cleanly, but cut along the side. The cut was fresh. I stood there frozen, listening. The silence was back, thick and heavy. I changed the tire as fast as I could, dropping tools, forcing myself not to panic. As I tightened the last bolt, I saw movement on the hill behind the car. A person standing still, far enough away that I could not see details. They did not wave. They did not move closer. They just stood there, watching. I did not wait to see what would happen next. I got in the car and drove, not stopping until the road turned back into pavement and my phone showed signal again. I never reported it. I never went back. The ending is clear to me now. Someone was out there who did not want to be seen and did not want me there. They had plenty of space to do whatever they wanted, and the only reason I am writing this is because I left when I did. The middle of nowhere is not empty. It just hides what is already there. I ended up out there because I wanted to be alone for a while. Not in a dramatic way, just tired of noise, tired of seeing the same streets and the same faces every day. I took a few days off work, packed my car with basic supplies, and drove until the roads stopped having names. The map on my phone showed long empty lines, patches of green, and nothing else. That was exactly what I wanted. Middle of nowhere meant no expectations and no interruptions. The place I stopped was a stretch of land between low hills and thick woods. There was no sign, no fence, no building in sight. Just dirt, rocks, and trees that looked old enough to have seen everything already. The air felt heavier there. Not in a scary way at first, just quiet. The kind of quiet where you notice your own breathing and the sound of your boots on the ground feels too loud. I parked the car on a flat patch and shut the engine off. The silence came back instantly, like the place was waiting for the noise to stop. I set up a small camp a short walk away from the car. Nothing fancy. A tent, a cooler, a flashlight, extra batteries, food that did not need cooking. I was careful and slow with everything. I checked the ground, checked the trees around me, checked the sky. The weather was clear but cold, and the sun was already starting to sink. The light stretched long shadows across the ground, and the woods looked deeper than they probably were. Still, nothing felt wrong yet. Just empty. As it got darker, the temperature dropped fast. I sat near the tent and ate while the last bit of daylight faded. The smell of dirt and dry leaves was strong. Somewhere far off, something moved through the brush, heavy enough to snap sticks but not close enough to see. I told myself it was just an animal passing through. That made sense. This was their place, not mine. I stayed still until the sounds faded, then went into the tent and zipped it shut. Sleep did not come easily. The ground felt harder than I expected, and every small sound seemed louder inside the tent. Wind moved through the trees, making them rub against each other in slow, uneven waves. Leaves scraped along the ground. Something brushed the side of the tent once, light and quick, then nothing. I lay there listening, counting breaths, waiting for my body to relax. Eventually, I drifted off without realizing it. I woke up in the middle of the night with my heart already beating fast. The air felt different, colder somehow. I stayed still and listened. There were footsteps outside the tent. Not heavy running, not random movement like an animal. Slow steps, steady, circling. Each step pressed into the dirt and leaves with weight behind it. I held my breath without thinking about it. The sound moved around the tent once, then paused close to where my head was. I could hear breathing outside, low and controlled. I stayed frozen. My mind tried to explain it away, but nothing fit cleanly. Wild animals did not move like that, not in calm circles. The footsteps stayed there for a long time, long enough for my legs to start aching from being still. Then they moved away slowly, back toward the trees. I did not hear anything after that. No retreating crash, no running. Just silence again. I did not sleep after that. I watched the inside of the tent slowly turn gray as morning came. When the sun finally rose enough to see clearly, I got out. The ground around the tent showed marks in the dirt. Footprints, not animal prints. Human, big, deep, and clear. They circled the tent once, exactly like I heard. They stopped near the front, then turned back the way they came. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the woods. I packed up fast, hands shaking, stomach tight. I kept looking up, scanning the trees, expecting to see someone watching me. There was nothing, no movement, no sound. Still, the feeling stayed with me, like pressure on the back of my neck. I loaded everything into the car and drove away without stopping. I did not look back. A few miles down the road, I noticed something that made my chest tighten again. In the dust on the side of the road, there were the same footprints, fresh, moving in the same direction as my car had gone before I arrived. It meant someone had been out there already, walking those empty roads, long before I set up camp. Maybe they saw my car. Maybe they followed it. I kept driving. When I finally reached a small town hours later, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time before getting out. Bright lights, people moving around, engines running. Normal life. I felt out of place, like I had brought something back with me from the woods. I checked the car carefully. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was missing. Still, my hands would not stop shaking. I never went back to that place. I did not tell anyone the full story. There was nothing dramatic to report, nothing that could be proven. Just footprints, sounds in the dark, and the clear understanding that someone had been there with me, close enough to touch the tent while I lay inside unable to move. The middle of nowhere is not empty. It just hides things better. The ending stayed with me because it was simple and clear. Nothing chased me. Nothing attacked me. Someone chose not to. That choice mattered more than any explanation. I learned that being alone out there is not peaceful the way people imagine. It is quiet enough for you to realize how small you are and how close danger can get without ever showing its face. I went out there because I wanted to be alone for a few days. Not in a dramatic way, just tired of noise, tired of people, tired of the same roads and the same buildings. I packed my truck with food, water, a small generator, and a tent, and I drove until the road stopped being paved and turned into gravel, then dirt, then nothing at all. The place was deep in open land. No signs, no houses, no phone signal. Just wide empty ground, low hills, dry grass, and a thin line of trees far in the distance. It felt like the kind of place nobody had any reason to visit. I parked near an old cattle fence that had fallen over and set up camp a little away from the truck. The wind was steady, not strong but constant, carrying dust and the smell of dry earth. During the day, everything felt normal. Birds flew low, insects moved through the grass, and the sky was huge and clear. I cooked my food, walked around, and took note of tire marks that looked old, almost faded. I assumed they were from ranchers or hunters from years back. I didn't think much of it. When the sun went down, the place changed. The dark came fast, faster than I expected. The land flattened into shadows, and the trees on the horizon turned into a solid black line. The wind dropped, and the quiet became heavy. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes you notice your own breathing and every small movement. I sat near my truck with a flashlight and listened. Nothing sounded wrong, but nothing sounded right either. The first night passed without anything happening, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, feeling like I needed to check outside the tent. The ground felt different at night, colder, harder, and the air smelled sharper. When morning came, I saw fresh marks in the dirt near the truck. Not animal tracks. They were long and uneven, like something had been dragged or pushed. I walked around them, trying to understand their direction, but they didn't clearly lead anywhere. They just stopped. I told myself it was probably from wind or some equipment from years ago finally shifting. I stayed another day. I shouldn't have, but I did. I explored farther out, walking toward the tree line. The land dipped and rose slightly, and I noticed pieces of metal half buried in the dirt. Old wire, broken posts, rusted scraps. It looked like something used to be there long ago, maybe a camp or work site that had been taken apart and left to rot. That night was worse. The air felt thick, like a storm was coming, but the sky stayed clear. I heard movement far away, slow and steady. Not running, not random, just constant movement across the ground. I stayed still and waited for it to stop. Didn't. It moved in a wide circle, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see it clearly. My flashlight showed nothing but grass and dirt, but I could hear it, something heavy shifting its weight. I stayed in the truck the rest of the night, engine off, lights off. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I stepped out carefully. The ground around the truck was marked again, deeper this time. Long impressions pressed hard into the dirt. There were places where the grass was flattened in wide paths, like something had paced back and forth for hours. I decided to leave. I packed fast, hands shaking more than I expected. When I turned the key, the engine hesitated before starting. That pause felt longer than it really was. As I drove back the way I came, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The dirt road had fresh marks going both directions. One set matched my tires. The other didn't. They were wide, uneven, and ran alongside the road for a long stretch before veering off into the open land. I didn't stop until I reached pavement. When I finally got phone signal again, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, just breathing. I checked the truck for damage and found deep scratches along the lower panels. Not from rocks, but from something dragging against it. The marks were high enough that it couldn't have been an animal I knew. Weeks later, I looked up old land records and local reports. The area wasn't officially abandoned, but it was avoided. Decades ago, heavy machinery was used out there for a failed project that was shut down suddenly. Equipment was left behind, and some of it was never recovered. People reported strange damage to vehicles and camps over the years, but nothing was ever explained clearly. No official warnings, just silence. I never went back. I sold the camping gear and fixed the truck, but I never felt the same about open, empty places again. What stayed with me wasn't fear in a dramatic sense. It was the understanding that some places are empty for a reason, and when you step into them, you don't always know what still moves there, waiting long after everyone else decided to stay away. I ended up out there by accident, the kind of accident that does not feel serious at first. I was driving alone on a back road that barely showed up on my phone map, cutting through miles of dry land and low hills. The sun was already sinking, and everything had that dull orange color that makes distances hard to judge. I was supposed to reach a small town before dark, but I took a turn too late and another one too early. After that, the road narrowed and the signs stopped completely. At first, I was not worried. I had fuel, food, water, and a full-size spare tire in the back. The road was rough but still drivable, a mix of cracked asphalt and gravel. No houses, no fences, no lights, Just open land and patches of trees that looked dead or burned from far away. The silence was heavy even with the engine running. No birds, no wind strong enough to move the grass. Just the sound of tires and the low hum of the car. Then the car started to feel wrong. The steering pulled slightly to the right. I slowed down and felt the back end wobble once. I stopped on the shoulder, which was barely wider than the car itself. When I got out, the smell of hot rubber hit me right away. The rear tire was shredded, not just flat but torn apart. Sharp pieces of rubber were scattered along the road behind me. I changed the tire slowly, sweating even though the air was cooling. The sky was already turning purple. When I finished and stood up, I realized how far the road stretched in both directions with nothing on it. No headlights, no dust trails, nothing moving at all. I checked my phone again. No signal, not even enough to load the map. I drove carefully after that, keeping the speed low. The spare tire was smaller and made the car feel uneven. After about 10 minutes, the road ended without warning. Not a dead end sign, not a barrier. Just dirt. A wide open dirt track that split into two directions and disappeared into the land. I stopped again, heart beating harder now. I chose the left path because it looked more used with deeper tire marks. The dirt track went on longer than I expected. The car bounced and rattled. Dust filled the air behind me, hanging low. Then the engine light came on. I felt a sharp drop in power, then another. I pulled over and shut the engine off before it could die on its own. When I tried to restart it, the engine turned once and then stopped completely. That was when the silence became real. No engine, no wind, no insects. Just the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven. I sat there for a while, hoping another car might appear, but nothing did. The sky darkened fast. Stars came out sharp and cold. With no lights around, the darkness felt thick, like it had weight. I grabbed my flashlight, backpack, and water. I locked the car out of habit even though it felt pointless. I decided to walk, not because I knew where I was going, but because sitting still felt worse. I followed the dirt track on foot, keeping the flashlight low to avoid blinding myself. Every step kicked up dust that stuck to my skin. After maybe half an hour, I noticed something off about the ground. The tire tracks were no longer random. They were repeating in the same pattern back and forth like vehicles had driven the same short stretch over and over. I stopped and scanned the area. The land was flat, but there were shapes in the distance, darker than the rest. Old structures, maybe sheds or trailers barely standing. As I walked closer, the smell changed. Oil, metal, something old and damp. The flashlight beam caught rusted car frames half buried in dirt. Some were stacked, some were flipped upside down. This was not a town. It was a dumping ground, hidden far from any main road. I moved slowly, careful where I stepped. Sharp metal stuck out of the ground like broken teeth. That was when I noticed the footprints. Fresh ones, pressed deep into the dirt. They were not mine. They circled the area, looping around the piles of metal. My chest tightened. I turned in place, scanning the darkness beyond the flashlight beam. Still nothing moved. No sound. But the feeling of being alone was gone, replaced by something worse. I backed away from the cars and kept walking, forcing myself not to rush. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. The land dipped slightly, and I followed the slope. In the distance, I saw a faint glow, weak and yellow. Not a fire, not a house light. Something low to the ground. As I got closer, I saw it was a small generator running beside a shack made of scrap wood and metal sheets. The place looked temporary, like it could be packed up and gone in a few hours. Tools were scattered outside, some clean, some stained dark. The generator noise was the only sound I had heard in a long time, and it made my head ache. I did not go inside. I did not touch anything. I stood there long enough to understand one thing clearly. This place was active. Someone was using it, and whoever it was did not want to be found near a real road or town. I turned around and walked away, keeping my steps steady. My light pointed ahead. I walked for hours. My legs burned, and my mouth went dry despite the water. The sky slowly lightened behind me. When the sun finally rose, It showed a thin paved road cutting across the land not far ahead. I almost collapsed when I reached it. Tire marks ran along it, fresh ones, leading toward a distant line of buildings. I followed that road until I reached a real town, small and quiet but real. I did not tell anyone exactly where I had been. I did not ask questions. Later that day, a tow truck brought my car back. The mechanic said the damage did not make sense for a normal blowout. Something sharp had torn into the tire while I was driving. I left the area as soon as my car was fixed. I never drove those back roads again. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I still think about how empty that land felt, and how clearly it showed that being far from people does not mean being alone. I ended up out there because I wanted space and quiet, and because I thought I could handle being alone better than I actually could. It was late summer, the kind where the days are still hot but the nights drop fast. I took my old car and drove for hours, turning off the highway onto smaller roads, then dirt roads, then something that barely looked like a road at all. There were no houses, no power lines, no signs. Just dry grass, low hills, and patches of trees that looked dark even in daylight. I parked near an open flat area and decided to stay the night. I wanted to prove something to myself, that I could be alone without noise, without people, without distractions. I set up a small camp with a tent, a cooler, and a flashlight. I left my phone in the car to save battery, thinking I would not need it. That choice stuck with me later. As the sun went down, the land changed. The air got still and heavy. Sounds carried farther than they should have. Every small noise felt louder because there was nothing else to cover it up. I ate a simple meal and sat on a folding chair, watching the light fade. The sky turned orange, then pink, then gray. When it finally went dark, it was dark in a way that cities never get. The stars were sharp and crowded. The ground around me disappeared past the reach of my flashlight. I went into the tent early because the silence started to press on me. Inside, every movement sounded too loud. The fabric moved slightly with the breeze, making soft rubbing sounds that kept pulling my attention. I lay there listening to the night, telling myself that everything I heard was normal. Wind through grass, small animals moving around, my own breathing. Sometime later, I heard something heavier. Not loud, but slow and steady. It sounded like footsteps far away, then closer, then stopping. I held still, waiting. The sound did not repeat right away. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or something larger. That explanation felt thin, but it was all I had. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again. This time it moved in a rough circle around where my tent was. The steps were uneven, sometimes dragging, sometimes firm. I could feel my chest tightening. I stayed silent, barely breathing, listening hard. There was no sniffing, no quick movements, nothing that matched an animal I knew. Just slow movement, stopping, then starting again. I reached for my flashlight but did not turn it on. I was afraid light would make things worse. The steps stopped very close enough that I could hear grass being pressed down. I could hear fabric shift slightly as if something brushed the side of the tent. My hands were shaking. My mouth felt dry. I waited for something to tear or grab, but nothing happened. After a long time, the steps moved away. I waited even longer before I dared to move. When I finally turned on the flashlight and unzipped the tent, the light showed nothing but empty ground and grass moving in the breeze. I stepped out slowly. The night felt wider than before. I walked a small circle around the camp, scanning everything. There were marks in the dirt. Footprints, not animal prints. They were long, uneven, and pressed deep, as if whoever made them had been carrying weight or walking with bad balance. I felt a cold, understanding settle in me. Someone else was out there. Someone who knew I was there. I packed up fast, not caring about being neat. I threw things into the car and started driving back the way I came. The road was rough, and the headlights showed dust and rocks jumping under the tires. I kept checking the mirrors, even though I knew it was useless in that darkness. After some distance, I saw something in the road ahead. A shape standing still right in the middle of the path. I slowed without thinking. The shape did not move. As I got closer, the headlights caught more detail. It was a person, thin, wearing dirty clothes, standing in a way that felt wrong, leaning slightly to one side. They did not wave or step aside. They just stood there. My heart was pounding so hard I felt sick. I did not stop. I swerved at the last second, just enough to miss them. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of their face. It was blank, eyes open too wide, mouth slightly open, no expression at all. I drove faster than I ever had on that road, not caring about the damage to the car. I did not stop until I reached the main road and saw the glow of distant lights. I pulled over and sat there shaking, trying to calm down. When the sun came up, I drove straight home. Later, I reported what happened. The police took notes, but I could tell they did not fully believe me. A few days after that, I went back in daylight with someone else. We found an old, half-collapsed shack not far from where I had camped. Inside were food cans, dirty blankets, and signs that someone had been living there for a long time. The footprints matched the area around it. The understanding was simple and heavy. I had camped near someone who did not want to be found. Someone who watched me in the dark and decided how close to get. Nothing supernatural, nothing unreal. Just another human, alone and broken, moving through the night. That made it worse than any story I had ever heard. I stopped going places just to prove I could handle them. Some places are empty for a reason, and sometimes you are not as alone as you think. I was driving through a part of the country that did not feel like it belonged to anyone. The road had narrowed hours ago, turning from clean black asphalt into cracked pavement with weeds growing through it. My phone had lost signal sometime before sunset, and the GPS froze on a screen that showed nothing but a thin gray line cutting through blank space. I remember thinking it would reconnect soon, that it always did, but it never did. The sky was already going dark, and the land around me was flat, open, and empty in a way that made distance hard to judge. There were no houses, no lights, no fences, nothing that suggested people lived anywhere nearby. I was tired from driving all day and planned to keep going until I found a town, or at least a gas station. The fuel needle was low enough to make me uncomfortable, but not low enough to panic yet. I rolled the windows down to stay awake. The air smelled dry and dusty, like dead grass and dirt that had not seen rain in a long time. The only sounds were the engine and the tires humming against the road. Every few minutes I passed old wooden poles with power lines that sagged and leaned, some of them broken and tied together with wire. They looked like they had been standing there for decades, barely holding on. After another half hour, the road ended without warning. There was no sign, no barrier, just a sudden turn into a wide dirt track that stretched out into the darkness. I slowed down and stopped. The engine ticked as it cooled, and the silence pressed in hard. I got out of the car and stood there, listening. There were no insects, no wind, nothing moving. Felt wrong, like the land itself was holding its breath. I checked the fuel again and realized I had less than I thought. Turning back might not be an option. I got back in the car and followed the dirt road, driving slowly to avoid rocks and deep ruts. Dust followed me like a cloud, visible in the headlights. After a while, I saw a structure ahead. At first it looked like a pile of shadows, but as I got closer, it became clear it was an old building. It was long and low, maybe once a storage place or a small factory. Parts of the roof had collapsed, and the walls were stained dark from years of weather. I stopped near it because there was a flat, open area beside the building where I could turn around if I needed to. I shut off the engine and stepped out again. The building made the place feel even more isolated. The smell of rust and old wood hung in the air. I walked around the outside, shining my phone flashlight along the walls. There were no windows left, just empty frames. The doors were gone, leaving wide openings that led into darkness. I told myself I was just checking for shelter in case I had to wait until morning. The truth was that being inside something felt safer than being out in the open, even if the place was falling apart. I went in slowly, watching where I stepped. The floor was covered in dirt, broken boards, and pieces of metal. The beam of light showed old equipment pushed against the walls, shapes I could not fully recognize, all covered in thick dust. As I moved deeper inside, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were fresh tire tracks on the dirt floor. They were clear and sharp, not old at all. Someone had been here recently. I froze and listened again. Still nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. Just silence. I backed toward the exit, careful not to make noise. Outside, the night felt colder. I walked back to my car and saw more tracks in the dirt around it. Not just tires, but footprints. They circled the car, close enough that someone could have touched it. The footprints were uneven, like the person had been dragging one foot or was very tired. I knew then that staying was not safe. I started the car and turned the headlights toward the dirt road. As I did, the lights caught movement far ahead. A shape crossed the road and disappeared behind a low hill. It was too far to see clearly, but it moved slowly, not like an animal running. I did not wait to understand it. I drove forward, heart pounding, dust filling the air again. The road twisted and dipped, and I kept expecting to see something in the headlights, but nothing appeared. My fuel light came on, glowing red and steady. I pushed the car harder, ignoring every sound it made. After what felt like forever, the dirt road connected to another paved road. I turned onto it without slowing down. 10 minutes later, I saw lights. Real lights. A small town with a single gas station and a few buildings clustered together. I pulled in and shut off the engine. My hands were shaking when I got out. I filled the tank and stood there under the bright white lights, feeling the weight of the place I had just left slowly fall away. I stayed in that town until morning. When the sun came up, the world looked normal again. I drove back the way I had come, just to prove to myself it was real. I found the paved road, the dirt track, but when I reached the spot where the building should have been, there was nothing. Just open land, flat and empty, with no tracks and no signs of anything ever standing there. I did not stop. I kept driving until the road widened and traffic appeared. I have driven through remote places since then, but I never ignore that feeling anymore. When a place feels empty in a way that does not make sense, I leave. Some parts of the middle of nowhere are empty for a reason, and whatever passes through them does not need to be understood to be avoided.